Hello, hello everyone. So glad to see that people are here. Hi Buffy, I hope you are doing well. I hope everybody is doing well today. So for today, what I have lined up is I wanted to finish going through that documentary by Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. Again, like one of the, if not the, top scholar when it comes to African American studies, Africana studies. And so I wanted to specifically go through it because, again, I have noticed that especially now that we're going to enter a very interesting time, and by interesting I mean we're going to be bombarded with lots of political stuff. Well, I mean, as we always are, but even more so now that there's going to be an election. There's always this discussion of race that sort of underlies everything, and I guess one thing I really want for people to be cognizant of is the fact that race is not something that ends at the U.S.-Mexico border, right? It's not then it's another race, right? There's a hard division. But rather to try to understand how race exists differently, right, in Latin America in particular, where, again, as was said yesterday, the legacy of slavery is something that is very different to Mexico, and that's what I can speak to most, because it abolished it upon declaring independence in 1810. But also the fact that a sort of separate population, right, that is completely separate from the rest of Mexican society, sort of had dwindled over time as time went on after the 17th century. So that's one thing that I guess I want us to think about together, is that the history of Mexico and its relationship to race is very different from the United States' conception of what race is. And so one thing that's kind of important, I think, to note with this documentary is that, there are famous, the La Bamba, right? That it was first really sung by African slaves, right, that were in the plantations of Veracruz. And later on, Ricky Valens, right, whose name was even changed to sound more white, right, because his name was Ricardo Valencia, or Valenzuela, I think, to make it more palatable, I'll put it like that, for white people. So this is why I think discussing these things is really important, because we don't want to forget sort of these legacies of racialization that still affect us to this day, obviously, but also how they are portrayed and how those effects occur. Obviously, we can't go into everything, otherwise this would be an infinite hour stream, but yeah, it's one of the things. But I hope everyone's doing well that's watching so far. I know that there's a couple of people. So
helado ice cream. Here you would you drop the D, so it's helado, or you drop the final S of some words, and it's really common among the people from African origin.
I've noticed some people will say "buenos dias" instead of "what is this?" And I thought, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you?
So that's something that you also see, for example, in Cuba, with most of the Caribbean dialects of Spanish. It does also happen to an extent with S's when it comes to Argentina, but that's for a different reason. That's more like a weird, it's almost like French, I guess, is one way I could compare it to, but I don't want to compare it directly, it's because of French immigration. It's because of the different multitudes of different languages that influence the Spanish of Argentina, meant that I believe when Elif and Efe And others had, and Yosiel had noted that like, oh, that's more of a porteño thing, which means that's more of a thing in Buenos Aires, right? So it's like more like how in New York you see that their form of speaking English is even less, well, English is already a non-rhotic language, which means that we don't actually use the r sound, right? The, like how Russian or Spanish do, right? Instead, we have this like it's like this weird sound in the back. It's like an alveolar sound. And so so when it comes to this in the Caribbean dialects, you see a lot of the T's and D's and the S's before, well, depending on where you're talking about, because this is why it's hard to make, obviously generalizations. But you will see the dropping of the S's at the end of words, and this is the same in Argentina, when it's before a consonant, right? But if it's before a vowel, like in Argentina, you would say the S. But in certain Caribbean dialects, you just drop the S's altogether, right? Because it's also spoken with a morphology and that's slightly different, right? Like they might not have as much of the schwa or as much of this sound, right? But that's just a linguistic history question. So an example would be like las casas in Argentina, right? To say the houses, but you can hear people that and you can say las casas, right? Like it's implied that there's an S there, but as soon as you say los ojos, the eyes, right, you have to put the S to make sure, it's not lo ojos, right? It doesn't make sense that way.
About an hour and a half from the Fandango's festive atmosphere sits the somber port of Veracruz.
So this, what they're showing here, this fortress, was actually the last part of Mexico. Now it's part of the harbor of what is now the Ciudad de Veracruz. But back in the day, right, like this was, obviously there's been lots of reclamation, right? Like New York City, like Manhattan used to be much smaller. They've reclaimed land from the sea and made it even bigger than it is now. And so in the same way, Veracruz, this fortress here, which was built by slaves immediately after they arrived to the Americas, essentially they had to build it up, and it's kind of like at that time it was offshore, so the ships would stop there, and then they would release the people, the slaves, to start working immediately to build this fortress, so then they could import more, and so it kind of speaks to the whole, like, whenever people try to say, like, oh, there's a very good book called Capitalism and Slavery, which is actually, like, on my throne wish list, but, because I've read it before, right? I've worked with it before. And so what it describes is, like, without the slavery of in the Americas, right, essentially you would not have the development of Britain, Spain, etc., blah, 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 into the economies that they became, right? Like, essentially that, like, when particularly right-wing people try to say that, like, oh, well, India could have chosen to become, like, a capitalist superpower instead of Britain. Well, the difference is, of course, that India didn't have colonies with all of this free labor, right, that were able to produce the primary goods, so that way they could only focus on the manufacturing side, right? Because at the beginning of the first industrial revolution, India and Britain had about the India, as in a very general concept, right? Like what I guess what is once called Hindustan, which included the entire subcontinent. So Pakistan, Kashmir, Jammu, Bangladesh, everything like that all together, and also Sri Lanka, had about the same output as Britain did, but really almost about this, almost if anything, technically had more. I mean, just because it's a larger space. But the point being that like the level of production was about the same. But it's because of slavery that, therefore, all of these fields, right, that were now enclosed, that would have otherwise been put to, whether it would have been cotton production or whether, I mean, that's just the first thing that comes to mind. But England is more known for its wool production. But regardless, other forms of production in that way for primary materials would have not been possible, right, if it wasn't for them able to, right, have the colonies outside of the metropole, which just means like the imperial core, right? That's one way of thinking of it. But the imperial core usually just means like now kind of means something a bit more expansive, right? It's the United States, really. But it can also include like NATO. Some people include that. Some academics, some socialist scholars might say that. But typically it just means the U.S. But the other word for it is metropole, right? And that's when we're talking about individual empires, right? Like Spain is the metropole for the entire Hispanophone Americas, right? Brazil, Portugal, right? Portugal's the metropole, etc., etc. So because of that, like that's why Portugal has all of these really why when Lisbon had this massive earthquake, right? Why it was able to rebuild and able to like redesign the whole city and build it with all these beautiful tile squares. If you've ever gone to Lisbon, it's something that you see. That you see in some places in Latin America, but you see this in Brazil especially, where you will have instead of the cobblestones that you might see like in Rome or in Paris, instead you see these almost they look like tiles, right? Almost they look like them, but they're not. And it's these flagstones that are of different colors, but they make them into these kind of like my shawl, right? Like designs, but they can be wavy. They can be like a royal, like a royal coat of arms or a knightly coat of arms, etc. They wouldn't have been able to do that if it wasn't for it being financed by the horrendous slavery that went on in Brazil. One of the reasons why, for example, Haiti was seen as a death sentence was because the turnover, again using capitalist language, of people, right, of slaves, of enslaved peoples, was so high because of the amount of work, the lack of care, right, the horrible conditions, right, that existed in Haiti, which is why when they had a successful rebellion, right, and they finally declared independence, that's why the United States, Haiti and Cuba, two countries that are right across this little channel from each other, are like the two countries that, breaking, a fan attending TwitchCon rushed to the hospital due to getting, wait, what? Rushed to the hospital due to getting punched in the face after tapping streamer Shakespeare on the shoulder to ask for picture? What? Okay, that's not true. Sun and Air, that's not true. I wish that I could be in Paris. Actually, it's funny because I didn't do anything. I would never do such a thing. Sun and Air, if you knew me, you would know that that's not like my style. So that's all I gotta say about that. So, oh my gosh. You're so silly, Sun and Air. So, uh, so, so essentially, that's one of the reasons why like Lisbon is so beautiful. But it's funny because I did want to go to Paris, but it's funny because I actually was gonna say like Buffy Geek, if we ever get a chance, like any time in our lives to ever meet in person, we need to go on a trip to Paris for sure. Um, I don't know. I forget what I remember yesterday, but I saw something that's in. I think it has something to do with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There's something in Paris that has that, and it's like a whole cafe that's like based on. I don't know. I could be wrong. I can't remember. I just like I'm trying to make that connection over again. So, yeah. So.
One of the main points of entry of Latin American slavery. Starting in 1535, virtually all of the commodities arriving in Mexico, including African slaves, were unloaded here.
It was called the Key of New Spain, the port of San Juan de Ulua.
Judith Hernandez studies the archaeology of Veracruz, and Sagrario Cruz Carretero is a professor of anthropology at the University of Veracruz. Both are helping me imagine the arrival of hundreds of thousands of slaves through this very port. How long did it take to get to
One thing I also want to sort of note is that one of the things that the 1917 Constitution, which I know I bring up a lot, but like I still think to me, obviously the issue is not, like I'm glad it's already in the Constitution, right? But the issue, is access, right? That with imperialized countries, it's like you can make something universal, but whether or not people can access it is dependent on a million other factors. And that is that in Mexico, all state universities, like the University of Veracruz, like the state, right? Or like even the most elite university, UNAM, are all for free. Like they're all universal education, all the way through a PhD. It's just that having the ability to attend school full time is, very difficult to do. Because of the fact that it's Mexico is an imperialized country. Oh my gosh! Thank you so much, Professor Q. Thank you. Oh yes, I love those little tea tins. They're so cute, aren't they? Oh my gosh, I don't know. I love those. I think they're so pretty. But thank you so much, Professor Q. I really appreciate it. You're that's very kind of you. I appreciate it. So.
Veracruz from the ports in Africa?
Some records mention 2 months.
That's a long time to be in a steam bath.
Right, and I found 20% of the load died.
Oh, can I just say that I don't like the language she just used? I mean, I know that she's probably using it like it. I mean, she's an academic, so she's using it in that, distance. I mean, perhaps, but it's still strange to think of it as a load of cargo, right? Like, yes, 20% of the load. Yeah, I don't know. It's just really. Like for me, even someone who spends their time talking about like how people will use this language or to sort of like downplay, or on the other hand do conspiracy theories, right? About like who ran the slave trade, etc. Blah blah blah. It's like dumbest thing ever. But anyway, point being that like they always talk about these human beings, right? Like actual human beings as though they were just a commodity, right? And that's the thing is like sometimes I've noticed that some people don't realize that like that is not a dog whistle, right? Like they're actually saying that like it outright. I know that she isn't. But like some people that discuss it like, oh well, like when they try to rationalize the high mortality rate, it's like that's literally trying to legitimize, right, a posteriori genocide, right? Like.
And in the 16th and early 17th centuries, 1 out of every 2 slaves bound for the Americas disembarked in Mexico. In fact,
So think about that. 1 out of every 2 slaves bound for the Americas within that time period went to one country alone. Of course, this is at a time when Mexico, or what is now Mexico, right, was part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. So it went from like what is now like Oregon, right, like where Tillamook is, interestingly enough, like Tillamook and that area, right, like that little last bit, you know, on the outlet towards the Pacific, all the way. Although technically Spain did claim parts of like what is now Alaska, but you know, all the way down to essentially what is now like the border of Costa Rica and Panama. Like that was considered new, like what the Viceroyalty of New Spain was. So, and also this is some of this stuff is pre-Inquisition too. Like this is why a lot of, like, it's sort of a separate point, but this is why a lot of secret Jews, or crypto Jews as they're often called, but now I think the term secret Jews kind of actually, you know, works as well too. Mainly because crypto bros have ruined the term crypto, right? But anyway, point being that this is why a lot of people moved over to, you know, that were in hiding, right? That had a, like as soon as they could pay or become indentured servants or whatever it might be, right? To do that, to get to the New World, to New Spain, they would do that because from 1521, when the Spaniards conquered, like finally defeated, quote unquote, right, like the Mexica, right, with all of their millions of, you know, indigenous allies, not them, but they got to claim, you know, the conquest, right, until 1571. So that's 50 years. There was no Inquisition, technically speaking, happening in New Spain. But once it starts like, right, it starts really bad. So that explains why, like, when a lot of Orthodox Jewish organizations try to, like, deny, or like, they will recognize some of the Sephardic Jewish people that were caught by the Inquisition in New Spain, but then they say, but the survivors, they don't get to claim their Jewishness, which to me is a very strange thing. But anyway.
In the year 1553, Viceroy Luis Velasco asked King Charles of Spain to curtail the trade, fearing an uprising, and with good reason. Until 1650, the number of blacks and mulattoes was roughly equal to the number of white people living here.
So, Henry Louis Gates, Dr. Gates, always, one thing I want to make sure is, like, when we are using this term, mulattoes, which in Spanish, right, is still used as a term. In fact, this is something Foreign Man in a Foreign Land went over, right? Like, certain terms that you cannot use in the United States might have a use in another right context, and that's why historians, cultural scholars alike, it's always about context. Hi Sarah, how are you? It's so good to see you. So, like, in Mexico, like, when my family, I've mentioned that I have family members, you know, past and, you know, currently still with us, so to speak, that are black, right? But the way how they will rationalize this is by trying to say, well, they're not black, they're mulatas, right? Like, I'm thinking about an aunt of mine, right? But that's in the Mexican context, right? Where there still is this kind of erasure of Afro-Mexican identity still. So one way of saying, like, oh, well, you know, there's the idea of you know, of mulattoes, right, in Mexico, which is also, again, very common in Latin America in general, particularly in the Caribbean basin and, you know, in Mexico as well. But point being that like, that's how, like, growing up, like, if it, like, instead of just saying like they're black, right? Like saying that, like instead they have to be like, oh, they're not black, they are this, right? They're this other category. Because again, one, there's this like pervasive anti-blackness within the Latinx and the Mexican community, right? And I think it's a common thing in Latin America. I mean, it is a thing in Latin America in general, that there's a very large degree of anti-blackness, and that comes from the, white supremacy. I think it could be more or less equivalent of Moreno here. We'll see, like, the thing is that in Mexico, because, and this is one of the things, like, historically, Mexico is the place where they really had, like, all of the categories, like they really, where they had those old, like, the castas painting, which did not actually, those paintings do not actually reflect the reality of what it was when the caste system was at its height. That's something that bourgeois people in the 18th century had painted to sort of think about the past, right? But like the idea of someone being un moreno, right? Because in Spain, technically speaking, like that surname Moreno just means that someone has dark hair. Like that's all it means historically. That's what it meant historically. But like in Mexico, you can say moreno, and that usually means that they're more indigenous, right? But yeah, I get what you mean. Yeah, like they might say that. Yeah, moren, etc. Morenex, essentially. But my family, they chose to say mulata because her features, right, like physically speaking, right, are outwardly black. But they didn't want to name her as being black, right? Or the rest of her family too. I'm focusing on this one example just because I can remember, like, this is kind of when, like, the caste system that, was installed in the Americas, like, 500 years ago still has an effect to this day, right? And so that's kind of where, like, in America, people in the US, people don't use those terms, and you're not supposed to use those terms, right? Like, white people are not supposed to use those terms, right? In Mexico, it's a bit different, because again, like, there are the history of racial ideology and racializing epistemologies, I suppose, to further abstract it, is, goes back to where everybody was, to where, everything was sort of like thought of as like almost like a pyramid, right? Where you had 3 points, and the nearer you were to this shade or to that, or to this point or to that point, it's like different shades of, supposed existence. In Peru, Afro-Peruvians are all like in their own space. In Yapatera, in Morropon, I think there's like 10,000 Afro-Peruvians, and there are like all descendants of African states. Yes, so like in Mexico, we also have that too, where there's a area, it's a very economically depressed, for a reason, right? Like this shows that, I mean, like the people that try to act like white supremacy is only there if white people, like, as such, right, are there, right? Like, oh, white supremacy only exists in white neighborhoods. Like, what? That doesn't even make sense. No. Like, the country itself, right, has always, like, once they were emancipated, right, that didn't get rid of the way, the racializing logics behind viewing them as lesser, right? According to the criollo or native-born whites, right? So the Costa Chica in Guerrero, which is literally named after like the third president of Mexico, who was black, essentially, what it meant is that area has been historically depressed. Again, it's called La Costa Chica. I think they probably will show it in this, because it's distinctly an area where the mixture, the cultural mixture that would have occurred, say, in Mexico City, right, didn't occur, right? Where instead, because there were plantations, because there was a plantation economy, and there was a separation, between the landowners and the workers of the land. That's why you see this area, like, once the land owning, at that time it would have been literally nobility, because before Mexico it used to be like its own kingdom essentially. So and it used to have actually many kingdoms within it. So the Spanish that would move over, like their kids would become the Duke of Guadalajara, but they mean the Guadalajara in Mexico, or the Count of whatever, of Mérida, who knows. Anyway, point being that they would give out all of these lands and all of this stuff to the nobles from Spain. So when the Spanish were kicked out right after the revolution, the War of Independence, that area in particular just has always been kept economically depressed as much as possible. Like, that is like, and especially in the late 19th century when Mexico tried to really Europeanize itself, right? I mean, the way how they actually worded it was like the group of people that were in charge of this sort of like Kulturkampf. Well, I guess that's no way of thinking of it, but what they wanted to do was to whiten Mexico, right? And they said they wanted to do that culturally, but also by, raising the amount of immigration from Europe as well. This was during the dictatorship known as the Porfiriato, where the group of people that were sort of in charge of making Mexico become more European, right, meant, of course, denying blackness and, denigrating indigeneity as well. And they were called los afrancesados, right? Literally the Frenchified ones. And so they were the ones that tried to make everything in Mexico seem as though it was a direct influence from France. That's why, if you see buildings built during this time, they're built to look as if though, you could be in Paris, as opposed to, using native forms of architectural design, et cetera, et cetera. But it's in this time in particular where no railroads go to La Costa Chica. No major highways, like later on, get built to La Costa Chica. And there are no critical infrastructure at all is ever implemented in this area. So it's like, it's intentionally kept like a century behind. And it happens to be the most black area of Mexico, right? So,
These are rings to which they tie their ships. The port didn't have a pier or docks. The ships arrived directly here.
What would happen when the slaves arrived? They would be checked medically?
They were paid surgeons to review the blacks. And the checkup consisted of licking the beard.
They licked there? That sounds nasty. Why?
The sweat conserved salt, so if you were salty, that meant they had good blood pressure.
How much did the slaves cost?
From 150 pesos to
what? I never, okay, that, like sometimes like when I hear the like when they start bringing out the calipers and shit, like, it's so weird that they would taste their sweat from right here, from their chin, to see if it was salty. I don't know. That's just such a weird thing. I mean, like, I know that like back in the day, people believed in all sorts of things, but that's like I don't know. To me, that's even more of a weird thing. Like, hey, I want to lick, everybody's chin to see if it's salty. I mean, like, I don't know. I mean, like, essentially, like, it's not saying that they have good blood, like, I mean, as they believe, right? Again, the idea is that everything is... She's right in that everything was thought of to be tied to blood, and this is still true today. It's just not as... I don't want to say it's not as explicit, because that would be incorrect. It's just that it's more normalized, or rather, it's I don't know. I don't even know how to put it. It's just like, it's just so pervasive in everything. That it's like a very different type of way of thinking about blood. But anyway, like what they're measuring is whether they're dehydrated or not. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, that's what they're actually measuring. But, you know.
400.
Oh.
Let me compare.
Okay.
The house cost 400 pesos.
Oh, wow. So a slave in a house. That's a lot.
It was a luxury.
Mm-hmm.
Inflation, right? No, but like, this is why when people try, like, again, who are the people purchasing slaves, right? It's the burgeoning bourgeoisie, right? And also the aristocracy, right? But it's like everybody else who's a peasant, who is a labor, right? Like, this is where the logics of racialization come in, so that way they see black slaves as also less than, right? And so, you know, this is where, like, when people try to say, well, it's weird when people try to act like one racism is like, oh, thank you so much, Miss Frizzle, thank you, I appreciate that. Also, it's very good to see you. I'm so glad you could make it to the stream today.
This is what the slaves would have seen first, after surviving the treacherous Middle Passage.
Yeah, also, the Middle Passage does not just refer to the United States. This is a big thing that I've actually, even other historians, it's kind of weird where, like, they think the Middle Passage only means to the United States. It's like, no, which I understand, because I don't understand, but I can see why people who are Americanists, right, who focus specifically on the United States and the way in which slavery existed in the United States and its consequences, might well forget, right, that it existed anywhere else, so to speak. I mean, not like literally, but you know what I mean, like that, like, well, it wasn't that, like, because there's this weird sense where they also try to see it as, like, unique, right, like, it's uniquely, right, and it is in a sense, because of course it was a minority population, right, whereas we just saw here the black and mulatto population was equal to the white population. So, you know, whereas again, like in the South, the majority of the population was still white. Just vast areas of the South had plantations that had. I got really offended by a chatter in a chat the other day, but I'm not sure I should have. Would you say all the Incans are wiped out and dead, or do they live through those that still speak Quechua? Wouldn't they be descendants just colonized? No, you are right to point that out. The idea, I mean, it's the same thing. Like, okay, like I can give you a direct analogy from using Mexico, right? People act like the Aztecs just disappeared one day. Right? Because I totally agree with you. And you're right. You're actually right. Like, that is the correct way to see this. They didn't wipe them out, right? Like, that's not what happened. Like, what happened in Mexico is that they were the aristocracy, right? Well, I mean, for one thing, is some of the Aztec or Mexica aristocracy was later given land grants, just like because their nobility, their titles were recognized by the Spanish crown, right? But this is a whole different story. But the people groups, like the people that speak Nahuatl, right, still exist all over Mexico. I mean, it's over 1.5 million people still speak Nahua to this day, right? As their, as either their primary or secondary but mother tongue, right? Like it's like a spoken in the home, right? And when people try to say, oh, well, with the Incans, well, again, who is defining what the Incans were / are, right? If it's Europeans, then it's easy for them to say, yes, well, we defeated them, and now there's no longer this group of, right, quote unquote, there's no longer this group. But that isn't true, because again, exactly like what you said, they live through the descendants of the people that speak the language, and the languages, right, that connect them to, again, to that, to the Incas, right? And yeah, exactly what Ms. Alf, the indigenous peoples of Texas, of which, again, there's it's like a huge variety, right? I mean, that's the problem, is whenever white people, to sort of simplify it, look at indigenous people, they want to put them into just the smallest amount of categories possible, right? If not just put them in one category. And that's why, like, when they say the Incas were blah blah blah, or the Aztecs, they act as though they were the only people that, the only people that spoke Nahuatl, the only people that shared that culture, right? So it would be like saying, oh, if you get everyone in Callao, right, like if everybody there moved away, Peru wouldn't exist anymore. Because that's the group that we're calling the real Peruvians, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. So, I mean, again, I'm trying to make an analogy, but, there were other people, right? Like, everybody, like, what happened to all the farmers? What happened to, they were still there, right? They're the ones who were, colonized by the Spanish. So, yeah, I agree with both you and all Miss Rizzle that yes, but, again, people hiding into violence. And in fact, speaking about Peru, in the, up sort of in the Andes, but also going down towards in the rainforest, right, like in the Amazon on the other side, there actually were people, indigenous groups, that they actually met with, secret Jews, like people that had tried to escape, the Inquisition in Spain by moving to the New World, right? And some of them, again, it's kind of hard to definitively say what was the case, right? But we do know that they were more accepting of the Jewish people, and they were willing to fight to defend them against the Spanish than they were to, like, turn them into the Spanish, right? So, so there are examples of even that, where, like, other colonized people, when they join forces together, right, against a common struggle, against oppression, right, they will fight together as long as they have solidarity. And so that's something that, like, is stuck in my mind, that it's like, that's why you hear stories of supposed people in Peru that indigenous people that were, like, converted to Judaism or whatever, blah blah blah. Again, I don't know, that, like, it's kind of hard to tell, because there are no records that remain to this day. It's only later, it's like 80 years later, someone writes about it, right? But there are many writings that say that there were crypto-Jews that, because they were willing to, essentially, not live in the colonized part, go out and to live with indigenous peoples and try to live alongside them, as opposed to, that's why they had knowledge of the Jewish Bible, or the Old Testament, as opposed to the Christian one. So when the Spanish did find them, they already knew stuff, and they were like, oh, how did these people find this stuff out, and so, like, a lot of the things that, so the knowledge that it was imparted, for example, allowed them to know that, like, stuff that the Spanish would make up, like, oh, like, there are the 10 Commandments, right? And they would add in things, right? Like, it's like, this is something they would do. or what they would say this was a crime or that was, against God, right? Is that, yeah, they were like, no, our friends over here, like, told us, like, you can't sit with us. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, but yeah, and so there is this history of, again, two oppressed, marginalized peoples, as much as they could, of course, right? And I think to me that was that there are other examples of this. In fact, there's an example that I would like to research more, but again, it's very difficult to find documents of like what exactly brought about this. But they had this like very similar situation, but it like there are apparently, I mean, I've seen a picture of a building that it was meant to look like a church, but it was actually used as a synagogue, like, but it's in an indigenous community, and that it's also like a similar story where like people, like, because they were able to lived in an area where the Spanish couldn't settle very easily, right? That they also had crypto-Jewish people that went there and found refuge among them because they were willing to, to see each other as equals and to work together against, the Spanish. And apparently that community lasted at least until the 19th century, if not possibly even into the 20th. But it's really hard to get into a lot of that unless you have like firm documentation. Like I've only seen like a few paragraphs here and there and then a picture, so I can't 100% say it's like, oh, that's exactly what happened. But
here they encountered a new country, a new language, and a new life as someone else's property.
These walls are covered with African blood because they were forced to construct these gorgeous buildings after the indigenous population decreased because illness. And they were forced to dive into the ocean and get these stones because they are made of coral.
I see, coral, yeah.
Think about that. Like, the first thing, like, you've just survived the Middle Passage, right? Horrendous, right? At least a 1 in 5 mortality rate. From what was said by the scholar here. And the first thing they make you do is, okay, now we need you to go back into that ocean to get coral stone. So that way you can build the fort to protect us so we can continue slaving. But yeah, they would make them dive into the waters right there just off the coast of Veracruz, because there are these islands called like Isla del Pájaro and something like that. And they're known for like coral reefs in that area, and so that's what they would make them go do that. So they actually, like, when they just had like a sandbar essentially and some of the foundations, everything else was built up by the slaves. And it's funny because even in Mexico, like, yes, it's very dangerous. There are sharks because it's warm. Like, there's lots of sharks. There's also lots of rifts where suddenly like it will drop off really, really quickly, and the currents, yeah. Yeah, it is strong. I mean, it is strong in the way how they used it. Well, they used the kind of like, they used a different kind. Like, it's not like it like the kind they use is strong. Like, it's like stone. The point being that they wanted to build a fortress out of something, stone, because the nearest mountains in where Veracruz are very far, right? Because that area is the only like area that's kind of like the southern part of the U.S., kind of like that, like Mississippi River Basin and like all of that, right, where it's like really, really flat. Hence why that area had a lot of African slaves brought there to Tlacotalpan, Coatzacoalcos, etc., Tampico, and so Yeah. But that stone is, I mean, most of it is the original, right? There were some parts that had to be restored because, again, as I said, after the United States, after Mexico declared independence and had defeated the Spanish everywhere else in the country, right? Essentially kicked them all out. The last place that they still held out was in this fortress. And because it's like Veracruz is really close to like Western Cuba, they could keep supplying it with, food, water, etc., soldiers. So they kept it on for like another 5-6 years, where they claim it's kind of like, not exactly. I think that would be a bad comparison, but it's like even though they just owned this little like island fortress, they acted like they owned the whole thing, like the whole rest of the country, but they didn't, right? Like, I mean, it's a weird like thing where they're like LARPing, where they're like receiving letters and stuff, and they're like, oh yes, I'm gonna send 500 soldiers, something they literally cannot do, and they're like responding as if they can do it. It's like really weird.
Yes, it's coral, and many of them died in this process. It's a history of
yes, that's the thing, is like the Spanish didn't mind didn't mind the danger that they were put into when it came to getting the stone. But they cared about was the value of the stone in defending the Spanish lives, right? Like
of death and a history of invisibility.
So this is the fingerprint of Black history.
Exactly, invisibility. Oh God, yeah.
Mexico.
Right.
It's right here.
Right.
Death and invisibility. Professor Sagrario Cruz has invited me to lunch, promising me 2 significant clues to help me solve the mystery of Mexico's missing Black population.
This is my family. Well, I show some pictures to show you. And this is a very old picture, and this is my grandpa with his sons.
The banditos.
Yes. And this is the wedding of my parents.
Oh, look how pretty your mom is.
But he is a dark man, and
She's light.
right.
So your family's part Black?
It's part Black, and it's something that was omitted until I was 19 years old.
How did you find out that you were part Black?
Because I traveled to Cuba. And when I arrived there, they started talking about the African heritage and the culture. I suddenly realized my family was Black.
Huh.
Because looked like my grandpa, looked like my father.
Yeah, no, they definitely look Black.
And when I started tasting the food, I said, oh my God, it's the food my grandma prepares at home.
Huh.
I recommend you to taste the mogo mogo.
That sounds African.
Yes, sounds African. And we have the same recipe in Puerto Rico, it's fufu.
In Ghana, fufu.
Right.
Fufu is like having a bowling ball in your belly. It
Yes,
is like,
yes. And in Cuba it's called mofongo. And here we have fried yuca.
I love fried yuca. It's like a big French fry. But
Right. This was originally prepared by slaves because they needed carbohydrate.
yeah, they had to work all day in the sun.
Right.
This is some good food.
All I'm gonna say is like seeing the food is making me what? Oh God. Yeah, it looks amazing, right? I'm hungry. Yeah, that's why people eat yuca there. That's why. Like, there's a whole bunch of food that, like, was either brought over from, like, either the African continent itself, or were other things that were, like, from the Antilles or the, on the continent of the Americas, and that again was usually used for yeah, it is so popular. I mean remember what it said in the beginning of this documentary, right? That's why I wanted to watch it, and I'm so glad you're here. Is that Mexico and Peru, right? Like it's talking about both of our countries, in the same episode, received more slaves during the entire slave trade. Received more slaves than the United States ever did during the entire slave trade. So, it's like, that goes to show that, like, there's a lot of things that, in Mexican music and Mexican food and Peruvian food and all these other things, right, that, like, and again, this kind of, like, invisibility as well, too, like, because people don't want to recognize like the origin of yuca, right, or of many different things, right, again, it's because there's a weird relationship with, like, if you admit blackness, then that opens the whole discussion, right, that a lot of people do not know how to handle, and that's because of systemic reasons, right? Like in Mexico, they don't even want to recognize Afro-Mexicans under the protected peoples of Mexico, right? I learned some about the colonial past of Belize. I would be interested. Oh, it's interesting that you bring up Belize because, it's one of the things that very interesting about Belize. It has many things that are interesting, but one, it's one of the few places where like it has there's the capital city of Quintana Roo, which is the state that has Tulum and what is that place called? Cancun. It's right across the river. It's like a small bay, and then that's where you can enter Belize. But it has this really interestingly storied history, right? Because the closer you get to the coast, to what used to be the capital, Belize City, before the hurricane, has always had more of an English influence, because of it being a colony. But also, if you go to Belmopan and to other places in the interior, it has more of a Spanish influence because of the fact that every other country that surrounds, is Spanish speaking, but also that some of these countries, like Guatemala, etc., did not have like a large scale of slavery ever occurring in its territory. So like instead you have Afro-Mestizos, right? Something that I mentioned was actually important in Texas, right? That is to say, people that are mixed between indigenous or mestizos and that are also black. That in Texas, I think this is a weird connection to Texas, Belize. That in Texas, when they were supposed to be given citizenship because Mexico had given them citizenship, but instead they used their blackness against them to say, you cannot be a citizen, and instead we're going to take your property and possibly re-enslave you. Yeah, Belizean Creole, yes, that's really cool. Yes, Belize, as people say in Spanish, is a really interesting place. There's this one really interesting aspect of Belize, though, that I just came to mind. The nation of Ireland, right? Like Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, has you love the language? Yeah. The Republic of Ireland has like a monopoly purchase on the entire banana crop of Belize every single year. Like essentially in perpetuity for the most part. Like people sometimes, and again, I'm not trying to say like, but it is something interesting to think of, because there was that like early 20th century, the whole idea of a banana republic, right? But it's not quite that, obviously. It's very different. But it is an interesting aspect that it's like Ireland has the monopoly on buying the entire banana crop of Belize.
How did it make you feel suddenly to discover you're black?
Weird. It was like if you will discover that you're adopted.
When you came back and told your family, did they tell you you went local?
I thought Belize was just a tourist location, a tax haven. I mean, that might be what like other people think of it. But they do export primary products, yeah. No, it has a really interesting history. it has connections actually to islands, well, one to the Mosquito Coast, which was which existed sort of to the southwest of it. There was a British colony for a while, but also to the islands of Providence, as they're called. Now they're called Las Islas de Providencia, but they went. Those islands were populated by essentially the same people that populated like the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the United States. So they were like, so essentially they were like religious, you know. So those islands were for the these islands still speak English, yeah, even though they're technically part of Colombia, although they're right next to like Honduras, like they're really far away from Colombia. And so Belize was one of those contacts where, because they had the Scottish church, right? The Church of Scotland, I should say, is Presbyterian in terms of its what Presbyterian means in terms of like when we're talking about ecclesiology, means that its governing structure is based on a presbyter, right? Hence Presbyterian, right? That it is voted upon by the congregation, and that there's like a council, right, that's running church affairs. This is opposed to the Anglican or Episcopalian way of doing the church, where it's a hierarchy of bishops, like the church at Rome, right? The Catholic Church, where the supreme, so to speak, bishop, right, the highest bishop, the Bishop of Rome, right, has the authority over all the others. Pics my grandpa went when he looked like he was camping. He would always have like a tent and dirt floor and sleeping bag on a cot. I swear he had another family. I don't know, that's really interesting that they use it when you mentioned that. I don't know. My neighbor said they are super strict about gender roles. Yes, yeah, oh yeah. Yes. I have heard that actually. That's why wait, no, never mind. I'm confusing it with something else. I'm thinking about or did they try to go there too? I wonder. That did you hear about that weird like cult? I like saying that, like I like how now that's just like a sentence people said, like, hey, did you hear about that weird cult? That it was like a ultra hyper orthodox Jewish one where they went like even beyond like what like normal Orthodox people do, right? Where they made like that they like fled from Canada, right? That they fled from Canada, and then they wound up in like, okay, well, if people are willing, if after this episode is done, if after we do like a shorter, sort of interlude, if you want, I could maybe pull it up and we could watch it, because I remember the initial documentary that's about it, and it's kind of insane, like in the sense that Canada accepted his request for political asylum, and again, this shows how like the asylum system in the U.S. and Canada are racialized, right? Like they didn't check up on his stuff because he's white, right? But like if anybody from like Latin America tried to do the same thing, I mean, rather I should say, we already know what they do to people to Latin America that are trying to seek asylum in the United States. I mean, like it happens every day, right? My neighbor, but yeah, they super strict gender roles, probably tied to racism. Also, like, I mean, yeah, I was about to say that, yeah. Yes, exactly, like, the turn that happened in the 60s and 70s in the United States, and that also has happened in places like Haiti. Well, Haiti kind of already had this, actually had it before the United States, I would say, I would argue, but, is, this, well, that aspect too about the gender roles is another thing too, is to conform to the white supremacist colonial view of of what you should be, right? Like that's one of the that's something you see in a lot of these colonies that still remain very closely tied to, I mean, they don't even have to be necessarily closely tied to, but like that have historically been, right, like very tied to to the metropole, right? So and said that wouldn't let him have locks or an afro. I know. It's crazy, like how recent people have been like known to have natural hair, right? Or if they want to have it. What's crazier still is that there are still many places, even in the supposed like enlightened liberal West, that don't allow that. Hi, Three Ghosts. Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Three Ghosts. I wanted to tell you personally, if you showed up on stream, thank you so much for fulfilling the yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that book is gonna be so useful. It's like I've been needing it. Like it's funny because I was actually like, oh gosh, like I need to actually look into it more, because I have some books right here that are like speak around it but are not the book itself, right? So yes, thank you so very much. I appreciate it. But yeah, I mean, because I also know that like in certain French colonies, like especially the ones that are still that have governments, right, that are very subservient. I don't know, maybe that's not even the right term. Still think about what France thinks about them, if that makes sense. Like they also do that too, where like they essentially want to mimic like the French schooling system, and they want to, and they send their kids off to the best schools in France, right? Like l'École Normale Supérieure, or La Sorbonne, or whatever it might be, right? But it's always at a depreciation or at a complete disappreciation of their own culture, right? And that's something that I never like. I just don't like. I've always found that to be very sad. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. Like, it's a lot of emotions. All I can say is just like sad, because it's like, it involves a lot of this like forcing upon of colonial white supremacist beauty standards, one, and then two, it's also trying to perpetuate those things societally. Yeah, it's a loss of culture, and it's a loss of culture that is incentivized to be seen as almost like a positive thing, right? And that's exactly what ended up in what happens in Mexico when it came to indigenous peoples. Like they want to see indigenous, and in the United States this is also the case, but in Mexico it's different, right? Because you do have, hello, Lakshmi, how are you? Thank you so much for coming into the stream and chatting. Welcome. So yeah, like where like the active, like they would rather have all the indigenous aspects of Mexico be anthropological, right, historical, not be current. And I think to me that's just like the weirdest thing ever. I'm doing good. I'm just here talking about this documentary here by Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. from Harvard. But yeah, otherwise I'm doing really great.
Oh, up there drinking too much rum.
I asked my grandpa, why you never told me we are black? And he called my hand and told me, sweetie, we are not black, we are morenos.
Oh, moreno.
Of course.
Exactly. Oh yeah. So FLFNF also noted earlier that, yeah, this would be another way And I think it's because, I guess in el norte, the northern part of Mexico, they wouldn't use that to talk about. I don't know. Just historically, I've never, my own, or rather I should say, in my own personal history, I've never heard it being used that way, for good or for worse, right? But yeah, I feel like Manip is right. It tracks that you can also say that. But you see how, well, see, that just shows that, like, my family decided to take another way of justifying it, right? Like, oh, well, our family doesn't have black people, it has mulattos, right? As if, it's talking about the, it's talking about the black populations in Latin America, particularly focusing on Mexico, where I'm from, and Peru, and sort of looking at how, you know, there's been this historical kind of erasure of black people in those countries.
He was aware that he was a black man, but he rejected that identity.
That's interesting.
And I think this happens in most families, that you had...
Exactly, like, in mine, they said mulata, or mulattos, but it was their way of trying to rationalize, like, no, it's not, like, real black, right? Like, it's something else, right? Like, it has to be something else. It can't be the real thing, right?
The black grandma in the closet.
The black grandma in the closet. Huh?
Yeah.
In America, traditionally, you had one drop of black blood, you were black. If the one drop rule were applied in Mexico...
Exactly. And again, the one drop rule in America, it's interesting because you know how, like, white online leftists often like to, oh, well, I'm 2%. This is why I don't like the whole race science thing, right? It's because that is literally a recapitulation, right, of the one drop rule. Like, it's just the one drop rule with extra steps, right? And you can see this because as soon as they find out they have blah 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 amount of this, they act as though somehow that gives them the right to, you know, use slurs, whatever it might be, right? But it doesn't, because they've never had to experience what it's like to be X, Y, Z, you know what I mean? So, like, that's the issue. Like, when they say, oh, well, I have some ancestor from 8 generations ago that was, you know, whatever, blah blah blah. So, but it's because of this idea that still exists in society that again is a way of justifying, right, like discrimination for all eternity, pretty much. Like, there's no way, because one drop, I mean, think about the idea of one drop of blood, right? Just think about that. One drop of blood is all it takes for every bit of you to be considered something non-white. And now think about how that exact measurement, one drop of blood, was the measurement that was used by the slave catchers, right? And the KKK and all of these other things, right? That eventually formulated itself into what is now the police in the United States. And now try to tell me that that there's no such thing as colorblindness. If anything, it's the opposite. It's that Americans cannot white Americans cannot see anything but race, right? When they say that, they're admitting that that's all they see, right? It's that they don't want anyone to question their rationale for it. And that's the issue with them, right? They want the one drop rule to exist forevermore, because, again, only under a white supremacist system would they try to use that, which has been used to oppress people, right, now as a way to continue to oppress people. Like, only people that benefit from white supremacy can do that. that's the issue that, I don't necessarily have to name names, but you know who I'm talking about, right? That's exactly what they do. So that's why every time, blah, 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 whoa, colorblind, we're so much different now. No, we're not. Because again, they will use it as a way to justify their own racism. So,
All of these people would be black.
Because according to the one drop rule, if that was, again, in Mexico, if that was the case, then I would be considered, again, using that logic, fully black. But when people see me, but that would also take away from my experience of the fact that also, I've always been seen as a brown person, right? As a Mexican person. And I do not have the experience of living as a black person. So it doesn't matter, I can bring up, oh yes, I have black ancestry, or I have, black family members, but I do not know their subjective experience. I do not know it. But I have my own, right? And that's where you build that bridge of understanding, not from oh, well, because they're part of my family, therefore now I can colonize their own trauma. That's not how that works. That's how white supremacy works. That's not how, solidarity works.
Almost 500 years separate the onset of the slave trade and rumors of black grandmothers in a Mexican family's closet today. What happened in between? From the market in Veracruz, African slaves were taken to work in mines, sugarcane fields, and wealthy homes, but they didn't accept their fates passively. By the early 17th century, at least 10% had run away, forming independent settlements called palenques. The most famous runaway and rebel leader was a man named Yanga.
There was this petition, I want to say 10 years ago. I don't know what would happen if they did it now, but 10 years ago, to have a statue of Yanga, who was this, again, he ran away from, being enslaved and fought actively against it, tried to get the group of people armed and founded this, kind of like what I was talking about earlier in Peru, right, with the indigenous peoples, or in Veracruz, in this area with the Jewish people and indigenous people, where European settlement was not, essentially couldn't happen, right? Like the way how they want, the way how they build, the way where they tend to live, etc. And it was these spaces that where people of all races, right, who were oppressed by, white supremacy, by the Spanish racial caste system, were able to find refuge. And that was something that was important and incumbent upon all the people that escaped to make sure that other people who escaped could find refuge there, right? There was no pulling up of the ladder, so to speak, right? Although, of course, this is I guess the whole ladder idea doesn't necessarily mean the same thing here, but that's a huge thing about Yanga, is that this was the whole point of these towns, these palenques, where it was whoever can reach these, who is willing to protect it and willing to, but is also able to make it there, right? Who can make it there and everything, can be free. But of course, with the, Spaniards can't go there because they're not oppressed, right? They can go, and this is actually true. This is actually true. And this just proves the whole, oh, white people had it bad at some point too. No. In Mexico, if you were white, and even if you were an orphan, all of the white orphans would get money from the church and from the crown, and be put, essentially be given all of these benefits because they were white. Everybody else was not. But all white people, regardless of whether they were born in Mexico or in Spain, whether they were, penniless or not, were still given opportunities, even back then, that nobody else had. And that was seen by the church as a necessity. and by the Viceroyalty of New Spain, and by the Crown of Spain as well. That no white person could ever be brought lower than than any of the other castas. And it's literally in this book right here, Race, Class and Politics in Colonial Mexico. Like, that's literally something they did. Like, the idea of a social safety net was a racial one initially when it first was really created. So this whole like, oh, the poor white, no, I don't want to hear any of that. That's not true. Like, we have all the historical evidence proving the contrary.
Founder of this town, which is located a few hours inland from Veracruz.
Exactly.
Who is Yanga?
A hero more than anything.
A black slave. Supposedly, he was a slave of the Spanish who broke the chains.
He freed himself from oppression that the Spanish had over him. And he also liberated the slaves.
What my girlfriend said.
That's why they call Yanga the first free town in the Americas.
Oh man, give me 5 to stop.
When there was once a time when I wrote about Yanga, and I did say it was the first in the colonized Americas. However, I did qualify it with that because I said I didn't want to erase indigenous places that were also free. But I also wanted to stress that like this is ours inland, but the more inland you go, the closer you get to the center of Spanish colonization, right? And so when I was writing about it, like everything that went into it was to recognize like the people who built Yanga and the other towns like this, they still had to worry about food, water, shelter, all these other things. And at any moment, if anyone knew where it was at, that it would be destroyed and they would all be re-enslaved, if not, Roblox, right? So again, like the collective solidarity that these people had to keep it free is something that, again, like when I did write about it, I stressed it so much. Like other historians will say, oh yes, it was free from blah blah blah, but it's like, no, like they didn't have fields to grow tons of corn, right, to make tortillas. They didn't have large pens of livestock. They had to work with the least amount of things possible, just enough so where the Spaniards can't tell where they are, right, or if they do know, to where they can't be, brought low, and still survived, right? Survive and keep it on going. So,
oh, you're the man. You're a genius. You could be a professor. In 1570, 50 years before the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock, Gaspar Yanga.
Think about that. 50 years before the Mayflower even brought those Karen-ass looking them pilgrims to America, to what is now called America, there already was Yanga. I'm gonna put it to you like this. When the British found out that there was a place like Yanga, they tried to make sure that could never happen in their own colonies. Yeah, Karen Asper. I mean, like, I don't even want to start. I mean, like, they were all Karens, okay? They were all Karens. Especially the ones from the Cotton family. Like, if you know, like, all them, yeah.
And several other men and women not only ran away from slavery, but...
Hello there, Ferret King. How are you? It's so good to see you. So glad you made it just to see the stream today.
spent 30 years hiding out in the mountains around Veracruz, attacking the Spanish in guerrilla raids and defending their community. The Spanish never could subdue them. Finally, in 1609, the Spanish admitted defeat.
Hi, Jakar. I'm doing very well, thank you. How about yourself? Oh, and Jakar here actually was able to publish an essay on their union work, and actually got it read, had it become an audio recording for people to listen to, which I think is awesome. Karens had to descend from Karens. I mean, yes, they literally did. They literally did. I mean, like, look. All I'm saying is, like, when you look and you hear the story about the Mayflower, like, it sounds like they legit went, like, okay. Side tangent. Ferris probably sick of me telling him what I'm learning, and I'm just like, shut up. So they legit asked for the manager. Like, I'm not even joking. Like the Puritans, not necessarily the Pilgrims, but the Puritans, right? Because they sometimes get them confused. Or rather, America likes to get them confused, even though they were two different groups of people. The Puritans came later, in the 1640s especially, to the United States, but they moved to the same area, right? Generally speaking, right? So the Puritans, legit, who are Karens, got so mad, right? Like during King James the First's reign, that they had all of these demands, right? That they demanded upon the church, etc. Blah blah blah, and they actually pulled a "take me to your manager," and they were like, "Okay, well, I'll take you to the manager," right? Hi, Polly. It's so good to see you. How are you? Oh my goodness, it's my big sister. Hi, Polly. King James Bible, most exciting Bible. No, but like they legit like showed up. Like they said, "Can we speak to your manager?" Right, to the Archbishop of Canterbury and all that stuff. And they're like, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Bird King. Wow, 4 months. Oh, that's good to hear, Polly. I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you so much for making it to the stream today. I hope you'll stay for a little while if possible." Oh my gosh, Ferret King, thank you so much for the tier 1 sub to Polly. But, like, hi, non-toxic bleach. Hi, it's so good to see you. But yeah, like, they legit went up to, they told the Anglican Church, like, "Take me to your manager." And then they legit ended up like, "Okay, fine, we're gonna take you to Hampton Court Palace." And they actually made them sit in this really hard bench in front of King James. And he was all like, "So, I hear you wanted to talk to the manager of the Church of England." Well, I am the manager of the Church of England, so... And that's the story of the founding of America. No, but essentially that led to the consequences that later on led to, the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and all that stuff. Off with your heads. Well, I mean, it's more like, he said, "I won't do anything." Like all of their demands, he's like, no. But he did allow for the new translation of the Bible. Hence the King James Version, which was one of their demands. So technically he did give in to the Karens, but just one thing. He's like, "Fine, I'll do this one thing," right? And he let some Karens, like some Karen Puritans, join in. So yeah, because the Bishop's Bible that they did under Queen Elizabeth was like there's one translation that comes to mind, like one part that like, it's, instead of saying, well, I'll put it like this. I'll just say the original, or rather what it says in the Bishop's Bible, the Elizabethan one. Throw your bread upon wet faces. What is that supposed to mean? Throw your bread on wet faces? Like, I don't know what Elizabeth was doing, but like, like, I don't know what she was, and like, I don't know how those faces got wet, but You know, and I don't know what kind of bread she's talking about, but if you're crying from hunger, give your bread to them. No, but it's true. Like, that's what it says. It says, throw your bread upon wet faces. The way how it's translated, rather more poetically, in the King James Bible is, cast thy bread upon the waters. You see the difference in translation there. Instead of throw your bread on wet faces, I'm just like, whose face? Like, why is it wet? Like, why are you throwing bread at people? You know, I don't even want to know. Cast your bread upon wet faces. Oh, it's a reference to like cast your bread upon the waters. Don't give your bread. No. It's that. Remember how it was by the water, the lake, the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus multiplied the loaves and the fish. Right? Like it's like that. Like if you cast it into the sea, it's, you know, it would multiply as well. But if you read it in the Bishop's Bible, it's like throw your bread at wet. It sounds like you're trying to throw your bread at people. Like, you know, like, oh yeah, like that dumbass kid over there, I'm gonna throw some bread on his face. You know, like, I don't know, just I'll tell you why their faces are wet. I mean, you know, I will say one thing. I mean, we're so fancy we dry our tears with food. You know, that's not actually that not that far off, actually. That actually does make me think of something biblical. The whole drying your tears with food, but it's a different reference. I remember like one thing like growing up, I always heard was my parents would be like, well, I mean, this is true, is that in the Middle Ages, at least for a part of it, definitely, like they didn't really have plates, right? Like in Europe, in most of Central Europe, they didn't have plates as we know them now. Not that they didn't have them, but they didn't really use them the way how we use them now, like for eating. Instead, they would use like stale, like hard bread, right? And then they would put the food on top of that and they would eat it, right? And then they would give that bread, the plate, to the poor people, to the servants. And they would say, this is your food. Right. So there's that. I guess in that case, you know, then you would be throwing your bread on wet faces, but you know, that's a whole different story. But yeah. But it, you know, but that was back then, you know. You know, things change. So anyway, so now we're talking about Yanga.
And offered Yanga his own independent town in exchange for peace.
So think about that. The Spanish had to claim defeat so that in 1609 they were like, yeah, we literally cannot defeat this this town. So we will let you have autonomy in exchange for peace. Like, think about that. Remember that at this point, Spain's empire is the most powerful empire on the planet, right? It's actually the first empire to whom the phrase "the sun never sets on the blank empire," it first was used to describe the Spanish Empire, because it, you know, actually was all over the world for the first time. So, like, think about that, right? Like, you had the most powerful navy, the most powerful army, and they couldn't defeat one town. That willingness to not want to go back into slavery, right? Let alone, you know, everything else.
Yanga settlement became what some scholars believe to be the very first town founded by free black people in all of the Americas. Are most of the people...
Think about that. If it's the first town built by free black people in the Americas, why isn't it celebrated? I wonder why.
around here black?
Well, most people aren't completely black, but we are morenos.
Cultures, they combine together and form others.
So what are you? What are you?
Mestizos. Mestizos because we're light brown.
Are you Moreno? Are you Moreno or no?
Look,
What are you, Indian?
I am black.
Sounds like a skill issue. I like that. It should be, exactly. It should be. And again, it's fun. Like, you see how everyone's like, well, we're mestizo, we're mestizo. Again, this was a narrative that was, I mean, when I mean narrative, I mean, of course, I mean in the sense of like sociological sense, historical sense, political sense, right? That was used to unify Mexico under a common identity, right? Was the idea of mestizaje being the common thread throughout all of Mexican culture, etc. But it typically only talks about the Spanish and particularly the Aztec indigenous side, not even the rest of the indigenous, just one group, as having come together and created this new race, essentially. It never mentions the fact that, of course, the reason why it's called La Plaza de las Tres Culturas, or the square, the plaza of the three cultures, is because they're talking about the African culture as well. Was also part of that. Like, everybody, to some degree, in Mexico has various levels of intermixture, of course. But like, you see how now they've created another category, moreno, or in my family's case, mulata, right, or mulatto, right? Like, I mean, not that they invented it, but rather that, again, like as Miss Frizzle said, right, to distance themselves from blackness, right? Like, even though that town was founded by freed black slaves, and everyone in here is from there, it's like, oh no, but we're not, like, it's like this really weird kind of thing. To be from that town, be proud of it, but also be like, oh yeah, but we. It's just, I don't know.
You're negra? You're very beautiful negra. Hernan Cortez, the famous Spanish conquistador, arrived in Veracruz in 1519. Then he headed to Mexico City, which the Aztecs called Tenochtitlan. One of his fellow conquistadors.
Okay, Henry is great, right? He's a cool guy, but I just have to. It's Tenochtitlan. Just
was a free black man named Juan Garrido. I'm following in his footsteps. Cortez was dazzled by the city's overall beauty, by its irrigation system, but especially by its gold. He brutally conquered it.
Like, one thing, this is looking, when I took a picture, I posted it on Twitter, of me in a bookstore. So they have a Casa de los Libros. They have this huge lake here called the Lake of Chapultepec. This is the Bosque de Chapultepec. It's this huge, huge park, like big, much bigger than Central Park. And up on the top of like its hills, right? They actually have like a castle that actually had royalty living in there at some point. Unfortunately, though, they were hello, Scribbles. How are you? It's so good to see you. So glad you could make it to the stream today. So like, he's looking off one of the like terraces of that castle. So that castle was now is a museum of art, but it was inhabited when the French invaded and installed a Habsburg to rule Mexico. But like the street that you're looking at, like where all these big buildings are, is called Avenida de la Reforma. No, Paseo de la Reforma, and it's huge. It's like this immense street, and yeah, it was Champs-Élysées took inspiration from this. People think for some reason, because it's Mexico, that Champs-Élysées was created first and then Mexico copied it, but actually they designed this first and then put a smaller version in Paris. Oh, that's so great to hear. Oh, that's awesome. I'm glad that you've been hearing in the background.
Today, Mexico City is constructed on top of ancient Tenochtitlan. With over 21 million residents, it's the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. I've come here to find treasures too. But these are housed in the National Museum of Mexico. So what are you taking me to see?
We're going to see the casta paintings.
The Casa paintings. By the end of the 17th century, interracial relationships were on the rise. The Catholic Church allowed marriage between all groups. The law granted freedom to the children of black slaves and indigenous women. White men increasingly impregnated black women.
They always begin with...
Oh, that's such a weird way to put it. Why did he have to put it like that? I don't know. That's such a weird way of thinking about it. Like, I mean, yes, but also, like, why? You have to say it like that. Right? Like, it's gross. Like up until this point, fine. But who says that? That's a little bit, I don't know.
Spanish and Indian, that it makes mestizo.
Right.
Mestizo and Spanish castiza.
Castiza.
The third one is castiza and Spanish, mixed Spanish.
Maria Elisa Velasquez is a professor of history and anthropology. These 18th century casta paintings were painted to show Europeans the diversity of the people here. These 16 images are sort of an anthropological cookbook, showing the results of mixing the genes of black people, brown people, and white people. What about me?
So, yeah, Sarah, it's best that you don't know what he just said. Because it was bad. It was bad. Like, everything was fine. Until the Fire Nation attacked, so to speak, you know, and like, he said there's one thing, and it's just like, no.
One in the 16.
You will be here, look.
Let me see.
This one, a mulatto. The little kid, that's the mulatto.
The beautiful brown baby like me.
But see, like, I know nothing of Latin America. The general Americans have more knowledge than me. Oh, they really don't have that much knowledge. If anything, probably, you know, being from Britain would probably be a help. You probably know even more than Americans do. Like, literally, I've met people that say, like, I'm not even joking. I've mentioned this on stream before. Once I told someone that I went to Mexico, and they told me that Mexico was one city. Like, it was just one city. One city. One. They're like, there's only one place. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, you think all the people that came here from, whose ancestors are from Mexico and shit, like, you think they came from one town? Like, I mean, like, what? Like, what are you talking about? She's like, yeah, it's just Tijuana, isn't it? I'm like, you think that's the whole country? And I mean, I didn't put it in this way. Instead, I tried to ask her so that way she could elaborate, because I was thinking maybe I'm misunderstanding, right? No, she literally thought that, like, whatever you see when you cross the border into Tijuana, like, that's it. I'm just like, well, that doesn't even make sense. Like, I don't even know. Anyway, I'm like, I don't know. Anyway, I'm not even gonna. We learn nothing of this part of the continent in England. I mean, you know. Points to South America, Mexico, yeah. Like, a lot of people in the United States just think that, like, everything south of the U.S.-Mexico border is just, like, all the same. And it's, like, literally, that couldn't be any further from the truth. Like, literally, like, every five, literally, like, every, you know, like, every 5 buildings, it's, like, the culture is completely different, or pretty much. Like, that's pretty much how it works. It's like every 10 miles they have, like, a, you know, completely different. Points to, yeah, pretty much, yeah, points to other parts of South America. Also, yeah, exactly, literally. Like, I wish that I would, you know, literally, like, I mean, it's like when people find out that Brazil speaks Portuguese, they're like, but they're part of Mexico, aren't they? It's like, no, what? That doesn't even make sense. It's you just said it was Brazil, like. But Polly, Polly, you know it's true. Like, even people in California are like that. Like, even people in California, they're like, oh yeah, it's just TJ, it's just Tijuana. Like, excuse me? Excuse me? Like, oh yeah, it's... I mean, and yet, if you were to say something like, oh, New York is just New York City, oh my goodness, like, white people act as though, you know, like, they're about to read you the Nuremberg Code, like Matt Baker from Ocean Beach. I wouldn't expect much from people who think Chicago is a state. It's definitely a state of mind, no? I remember in California there were only 4 races, black. Yeah, exactly. I just like how that's the only one that's Mexican Americans, like, and the white people, the Mexican. But yeah, like it's interesting because they bring up the casta paintings, and you know it's interesting because Dr. Gates, right, would not be. I mean, like again, you look at these paintings, right, and you know he does call them like a recipe book, right, which is one way of thinking about them. But to me, I guess, because to me they're like very horrific, right, in one sense. I can't see them in this very lighthearted way, so to speak. But it's interesting how they're like, ah, yes, you're not black, you're now this category, right? As though, like, in the United States, like, the categories themselves aren't, as it were, like, defined in such a way, right, that such a distinction wouldn't even be made.
What would Barack Obama be?
Also a mulatto.
Okay, Beyonce, she would be mulatto?
Yes.
What would Tiger Woods be?
A lobo with African descent blood and also indigenous blood.
These people were crazy.
Yes, they.
What, like you see, like these again these in between or these other classifications that people sort of thought up of, right? It's like, it's literally them doing racial calculus, right? It's like, that's the reason why I'm not into race science, right? It's the reason why, like, as soon as people bring in, like, oh, well, my 23andMe says that I'm, you know, 0.1% blah, 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 so that means now I can use this word. It's like, no, like, we don't want this. We do not want, I mean, this is not even that bad, but it's like, as I was saying earlier, like, the whole, like, obsession with, like, with the whole, like, you know, the race science, like the whole 23andMe, the Ancestry.com stuff, like all of that stuff is just like the one drop rule, but now white people using it to oppress people of color again, right? Like in another way. Like that's all they do, right? And I don't know, it's just like, to me that's always been this very strange thing that, like, in the United States, people, like, I've never met a white person that didn't claim that they were like, oh yeah, some 1/16th Cherokee or whatever. It's like, there are not enough people on, you know, like, that's mathematically impossible because you were too busy genociding them, you know.
It's pseudo-scientific reasons to explain why some cultures will be inferior, and you have to make them slaves.
And they found it.
They found it.
16 shades of blackness.
Yes.
Oh, really? I mean, like, it's so common, though. Like, it is very common in the U.S. for people to claim some indigenous, but it's funny because they would never, like Mexican people who are, you know, have, say they did have, quote unquote, that amount of ancestry, they wouldn't claim to be that, they would never claim that indigenous ancestry, right? or rather, in Mexico, they would never do that, right? But in the United States, right, like, they will do that again as a way to use the one drop rule and all of that stuff against BIPOC people, against BIPOC all over again, right? First it was used for, you know, to oppress, right, people of other races, right, that were, again, invented by white people anyway. And now it's being used so that, once again, white people can now colonize and can colonize BIPOC spaces too. Like, this is why when people say, oh, why do people need a and Polly, I know you've gone over this too. It's like, why would people want to have a separate space or a separate graduation ceremony? It's just like, because people want to have it, right? Like, and they should be able to have it. It's not like oh, therefore we have to have an all white one. No, the thing is that it's been all white until very recently in history. That's the issue. So if people want to have, right, their own, ceremony, it's either done as a corollary to the primary ceremony, which is which is the one that used to be all white anyway, or it's done as a separate event. So then that way, again, like specific cultural things, could happen, etc. But even then, it's not for white people to decide for others. But the whole 23andMe shit and all of that is used, and all this other stuff too, as to it's the same way like how people will use other, right, interstices of identity to then use it against people, right? Like, I don't want to reference precisely who Polly was talking about last night, but it's like them, plural, right, using this or that identity, right, is so that way they can, say, oh, now that I can identify as this, now I can do the worst things, right? Like, that's not how that goes. Like, that's not how that works. But, and that shows, if anything, that self-reports that they do know, that they do see race. As I said earlier, that shows that white people cannot see anything but race. That's the issue. Like, the more colorblind they claim to be, that's the more you know that's all that they can see. They cannot see anything but race. Let me see here. My ex, who was really racist, was obsessed with 23andMe. I never made that connection. Yeah, they, again, like, I bring in the example of Nick Fuentes, right? Like, people always try to be like, well, he's Hispanic, right? As if that's a race, or Latino, as if that's a race. They're not. Obviously, he is white. But when he took the 23andMe and he had this, like, small amount of indigenous ancestry, right? Which is neither here nor there, but the whole point being that he then used it as like, now people cannot accuse me of being a white supremacist, right? Like, now people cannot, like, literally, he did this on stream. I've only seen the clip of it, because, like, I think all of his old streams got nuked anyway, but the point being that he specifically started to say that, right? Specifically. And that's why, like, if you see his Twitter, or at least if you have seen it, like, that's why he will put, like, Afro-Latino on there or something like that. He does it, and that's exactly what people who do this with other things, like, say, prognoses or diagnoses, right, when it comes to mental, psychiatric conditions, etc., right? It's like, they're not using it to understand their existence in the world. No, they're using it to harm other people's existences in the world. Yeah, it's a DNA test. It's just let people do things they enjoy. Wow, what a concept. But white people be like, yeah, but ours have to be better, or else, or at least also an option. Yeah, I never will. Well, I can understand why they're unhinged, because it's literally saying it, because it's any time that there is a space that exists, I can't say that it's outside of whiteness, like, as such, right, like, ideologically speaking, but that there's a space where white people are not, as it were, given the, I guess, the full gambit of privilege, right? To do whatever. I mean, and even then that's questionable, right? Is that because even the idea of like a commencement ceremony, right, is a, you know. But anyway, that's a whole different story. But as soon as you have these spaces, right, these queer spaces or these Latinx spaces or black spaces, right? It's like the whole reason why they are upset at that is because, one, they get to define, at least in their minds, right, in the white supremacist way, they are the ones who define what space is, right? They are the ones that define what the absence of something is, right? Because that's what whiteness is. It's a negative ontology. It's saying we're not this, right? So when you create a space where that's affirming, right? I mean, this is why like the idea of gender affirming care is really something that like transphobes hate, because the idea that gender can be affirmed, right, is something that, you know, troubles them a lot, because they want to make it seem like as though it's natural, right? Just give me one quick second. I have to answer a phone call really quick.
haven't done in a while. So over the last week or so, there's been a lot of attention paid to a music video we're going to get into in just 1 second. Yes, sir. Big dick, big dick. Big old dick, dick. 3 big balls. Look like we playing tennis. He got a big dick. I think his name Dennis. I jerk his dick until that N-word finish. His dick egg and green tastes just like spinach. Dudes. I love when they send me all the news. Had to make him nut cause his balls were blue. He didn't have a clue. He's sliding in and out my ass like he's cleaning out gutters. Dick bigger than a stick of butter. So the big dick swinging up in the motherfucking hallway. He liked me and my friends cause we were all gay. We liked dick. I like his ass cause it's thick. And he going to fuck my butt till I shit and dick his dry so. Therefore I spit on the tip. And it gets significantly more vulgar. Like a lot more vulgar. 4 big guys. And they bust on my eyes. They eat my ass just like apple pie. If they keep fucking me like this, I might just die. They bite my booty till I cry. He licked my dick and the cum start dripping. I took a bite of his ass. It tastes like lemon pepper chicken. He throw me up in the air. My booty flipping. He dunking his balls in my booty like he Scotty Pippen. Met the N-word last night. And I rode his dick like a bike. He's so thick, he looks like the type. But let's say hypothetically, I think his name might Jordan. He fucked me while recording. He sent me butt pics this morning. Hands down, greatest news I've received. I love when I receive his BBC. Three big balls. Look like we playing tennis. He got a big dick. I think his name Dennis. I jerk his dick until that N-word finish. His dick egg and green tastes just like spinach. Dudes. I love when they send me all the news. Had to make him nut cause his balls were blue. He didn't have a clue. He's sliding in and out my ass like he's cleaning out gutters. Dick bigger than a stick of butter. So the big dick swinging up in the motherfucking hallway. He liked me and my friends cause we were all gay. We liked dick. I liked his ass cause it's thick. And he going to fuck my butt till I shit and dick his dry soap.
So therefore, I spit on the tip. As one should. It is only polite to do so. So, let's see here. Okay, so we're back. And I have candy, because just like Polly, I also sometimes need candy, but I don't know if I could eat an entire bag of the little lollipops that she had. Like, I can do one, but I don't know if but gummy bears, that's my thing. Like, for sure gummy bears, like that's my thing. Yes, like, I have candy. In fact, it's funny because I bought a whole bag of gummy bears just for when I stream, because it's like, I need that too, just like you do. Yeah, I love, and they're the ones I get are the ones that have a pavilions. So they're the ones that are like the 12 different flavors, so they're like all even more different colors and everything. Hi, DJ. Yeah. Gummy balls. Yeah.
But why were you?
I mean, gummy balls, of course, but
white people more willing to sleep with black people than my white people?
Quite well, because the culture of the Spanish.
Oh, thank you so much, Zara. I appreciate that. Yeah, kind of like wore off because I kept drinking my my lemonade in my mermaid cup. But
Spanish church allowed the
3 big gummy balls.
marriage between all the ethnic groups, and also the Spanish people have an heritage more open to the mixture because of the Arabic presence in Spain.
The wars in Spain for 800 years or whatever.
Right. Yeah. So it was kind of easy to have these mixtures, and I think
to me it's crazy how like Spain was under Muslim rule and more open as a society for longer than it has been not, so after 1492. Like, thinking about that, right? Like, it was anyway.
That's a different story from the United States.
By 1810, emboldened by the American Revolution and the French Revolution, Mexicans sought their own independence, but it would take time. So the War of Independence, 1810-1821.
Yes, it was a very long war.
The revolution was started by a priest named Father Hidalgo. He called for the abolition of all castes, saying Indians, mulattoes, and other castes all will be known as Americans. After he was killed, his cause was taken up in succession by two generals, a priest named Jose Maria Morelos and Vicente Guerrero.
In fact, both were Afro-descendants.
Wait a minute. Two black people were generals in the War of Independence.
Were not only that, but they were also like the actual rulers of Mexico. Guerrero, Vicente Guerrero was actually a president of Mexico. So.
Yes.
So this is like George Washington being black.
Yes.
For Americans.
Yes.
That's astonishing.
Yes.
After Morelos was killed by the Spanish in 1815, the Negro Guerrero, as his enemies mockingly called him, saw the war to its conclusion.
Do you notice what he just said right now? What they mockingly called him, what they used as a term to mock Guerrero, right? It wasn't, oh, it's a historical quote, or oh, it's just the term they used. No, it's how you use the term. That's the problem, right? Like here in Southern California, well, I mean, really anywhere in California, if people refer to me in very different ways, if they just say, oh, they are Mexican, but if they start saying Mexican in a very particular way, then it crosses a line where it's no longer just a descriptor, right? Now it's something else, right? It's supposed to be denigrating. It's supposed to be,
With the help of many black Mexicans. In one story, Guerrero's father beseeched him to surrender to the Spanish. In front of his men, he answered, "You are my father, but the country comes first." La patria es primero is now a famous phrase throughout Mexico.
Yes, and in fact, in 1830, Guerrero stopped slavery by writing the law in the Constitution.
33 years before Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yes. Also, an important thing about Guerrero is that he was the second president in Mexico.
So you had your Barack Obama.
Second president of Mexico.
In 1830.
That's right.
So once again, Mexico.
Think about that. Like, imagine if the United States would have had, I doubt, literally, I kid you not, like when Martin van Buren ran to be president, okay? Because he's Dutch, right? Like, Van Buren, right? I know people just say Van Buren, but like Van Buren, right? People were like, this dude doesn't deserve to be the president because he's not like one of us. Like, think about that. They said that about the Dutch. The Dutch. Back then, okay? Like, that's... Like, literally, like, one of the other whitest people ever, right? Like, the Dutch. They're like, nah, this dude, no, there's no way. There's no way. He's too, him and his Dutch ways. Like, I don't even know.
The head of the United States.
Yes, of course.
That's amazing. Imagine if George Washington and John Adams had been African Americans. Would we have needed a civil rights movement? When Guerrero, who was a mulatto, abolished slavery, he also eliminated racial categories from birth, marriage, and death certificates. Today, there are states and...
This is why, when it was abolished from death, marriage, and birth certificates, it's a weird order to put them in: death, marriage, and then birth. But anyway, is also why the Mexican census also doesn't ask about race. For a while, it did start to do that, but now it doesn't. It doesn't. For more than 100 years, it hasn't asked about race because it's just unimportant. Like,
towns all over Mexico named after Morelos and Guerrero. Morelos is even on the 50 peso bill, but many Mexicans don't even know that they were black men, or that they owe their...
That's the sad part, is most people do not know Morelos. In fact, I remember, because Morelos is known for wearing this, like, I don't know what to call it, like this, almost like a bandana, I guess, one would, like, across his head. And apparently that was something that, this also happened in the slave states of the United States as well, where that was something that was done for people who, again, for slaves that worked out in the fields, right, to protect, themselves from getting sunburned, as well as other things, right? And, like, you see this image, like, he's the only one wearing it, right? And so it was this weird thing. They said it was an indigenous thing. But it wasn't, right? It was a weird way to, like, just, like, I guess kind of forget the fact that, you know, he was wearing it because, again, his family was black. So, and he wore it as a sign not only of understanding, because he did understand to a great extent, hence why he became a priest, to be, because that was a way of moving up in society, right, back then, access to education, literacy, etc. But, like, he still lived and still, obviously, was related to people who still lived in some form of servitude or another. So, like, it was him also saying, like, him not forgetting his own roots, which is hilarious, or really not hilarious, actually it's rather sad, that now, like, Mexicans don't remember their own roots when it comes to this, right? So,
independence to these two men of visible African descent. After almost a century of denying its multicultural and multiracial roots and an official policy of whitening, Mexico began...
Yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier. Mexico used to have an official policy of whitening. And, like, the people that, I kid you not, that, like, they, like, Porfirio Diaz was, like, so fucking horny for the French. Like, he literally was, like, if, like, any French person would move to France, like, I swear, like, you know. But anyway, I mean, would move to Mexico, he would just, like, I don't even know. But what Mexico did end up getting was a lot of German Catholics and Polish people, which is why you see the influence in the music. But, you know, in the rancheras and all of that stuff. Because the northern parts of Mexico had less of an indigenous population. And once, of course, they were able to do, like, larger water, you know, irrigation projects, then all of the lands that weren't, well, pretty much all of the lands, because indigenous people that did live there, the French were probably, yeah, that's true. I mean, like, again, yeah, it's true. In fact, there's actually a movie that talks about this. It's called, like, The List of 41. And it talks about, there was this one person who was, like, married to, like, to Porfirio Diaz's, like, niece or whatever, or his daughter or whatever. And that, like, she knew he was gay, right? Like, you know, and was closeted. And the thing is that it kind of, you know, it scandalizes a lot of things that, you know, because a lot of it is conjecture, but a lot of it is them, you know, wanting to make it very, you know, sexy. It's like, oh, suddenly, you know, it's like first time he ever hooks up with some dude, it's like, oh, you know, very, yeah, anyway. But, like, well, I mean, another thing, too, is that because the Mexico also had, well, I mean, it's just a whole different thing. Yes, you know, the French are horny for everyone, yes. And so he, essentially, that's what he wanted to make Mexico, but, like, through whiteness, I suppose. Through whitening, I should say.
To embrace a new national identity. In 1925, the philosopher Jose Vasconcelos published an electrifying essay called The Cosmic Race, arguing that Mexico's mixed-race heritage made it superior and unique.
Okay. This is the point where, like, my own emphasis on this topic right here. You need more coffee? I mean, I actually might have to make myself some coffee in a little bit, but I actually want to make myself café de olla, but it's just too much work to make just for me. Like, I've been craving café de olla. But anyway, The Cosmic Race, that book, La Raza Cósmica, I wouldn't be singing its praises. Like, it's literally like, hey, instead of, like, the Nazi idea of, like, you know, the pure Aryan race, what if we were to do, like, the opposite? And that's the, you know, like, that's, like, its own, you know, it's just purity with extra steps, right? It's just, like, a rehashing of it, but just saying, And then it's so weird because it's so weirdly sexual too. Like there is a lot of problems, and I've read it. And when I've read it, I didn't have to, but I read it in the original. The way how he talks about like the fecund love of the Spanish for the indigenous people. I mean, like if you know what that's trying to get at, that's all I gotta say. Like he goes into way too much detail. That's all I'm gonna say. Like when he's talking about like ethnogenesis, he's doing some like POVs, for like Pornhub stuff, like that's what he wants to be doing, right? But in reality, of course, he's essentially just like, you have the pure Aryan, Hyperborean race on Germany, right, being thought of. And then in him, he's like, cool idea, but what if, it's this? However, it does require that everything, like all of the positive attributes are all thanks to the Spanish and to the Europeans. That's the problem. Like the white supremacy isn't gone, right? And in fact, in the rest of the book, where he goes on his travels to Brazil and to Argentina, there is some weird he's just a weird dude, Jose Vasconcelos. He's like getting really creepy about like Italian immigrants to Brazil and these coffee farms, because he's like keeps talking about their like young daughters. I'm like, bruh, like Lolita's gonna be written in like 20 years, okay? Just wait. You know what I mean? Like, wait. Because he's just like, anyway, regardless, the whole point of the thing is like, what if there was another master race, right? But it's the cosmic race. That's hence the name. Some people have tried to read it as like an anti-racist text historically, because it praises, right, intermixture, but it does so fully aware that it's ending indigenous culture, right? Like that's precisely one of the things that's necessary, right? Like, yes, all of the cultures, all the 5 races, the 5 racial trunks, as he names, or the 4 racial trunks, I should say, that he says, will now come together to form the 5th and final race. You know what I mean? Like, that doesn't sound very progressive to me. Like, that's almost like a direct quote. Like, that's as close to one as I can give you. Like, do you see what I mean? Like, that's a little bit, I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Yeah, that's just adding on like a new lore DLC extension, pretty much.
Almost overnight.
But for like racism, it's like, yeah.
Mexico's mestizaje culture became a popular brown pride movement. But if everyone was brown now...
Oh gosh. No. Okay. Again, Dr. Gates is great, but this is the one part where I'm just like, no, that's not how that happened. The mestizaje narrative was something that Vasconcelos, when he was the Secretary of Public Education. And so one thing that's different about, well, actually, you know what's so funny is there's a book, actually, I should probably put it on Throne. It's called Backroads Pragmatists. And it actually explains this, where legit, like, Mexico was able to revolutionize its education system to the point that, like, it was given accolades by, like, UNESCO, or I forget exactly who gave them the accolades, but the point being that, like, the U.S. was so cucked because of, like, states' rights and all that stuff, and personal liberty and all that, because it's always used for racist, white supremacist ends, right? Like, when people say states' rights, it's just like, it's just another way of saying, how do we give power to the people that, quote unquote, should have power, right? Like, that should, right, does not include BIPOC. It does not include the marginalized, right? Again, knowing how bourgeois democracy works. So, anyway, like the book is them saying we're so cucked by, essentially, the United States way how they do things, because one, it's the United States, but two, Mexico instead said, okay, if we're going to educate, if we're going to teach people, this was right after the revolution, right, in the 20s. Those 2 decades just after the revolution were like the most, was when the revolutionary, was before it went full on revisionist and then later fascist, essentially. And so they said, like, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on trying to get education to the remotest places in the country. And we're going to start, like, a school for people to learn how to teach the newest teaching methods, right? The latest teaching methods. And then after they are done with training, so progress on infrastructure and stuff was in that window. Yeah, like that's, like, it's in that time frame when you get all of the, well, one, because you have the 1917 Constitution, which is often cited, again, as I mentioned before, as the most progressive charter in the world, right? And again, the only place that was also having a revolution in 1917 was, the Soviet Union, or what became the Soviet Union. In fact, that's actually why the United States had a Red Scare about Bolshevik Mexico. I'm not even joking. Like, that's literally what the New York Times said as its headline. Like, Bolshevik Mexico educating peasants. Like, I'm just like, oh, the horror of educating peasants. Like, literally, like, it probably, like, anyway, but so yeah, because it's within this time period that you get the nationalization of a lot of the, right, the expropriation of lands, the expropriation of and then it kind of reaches its end with Lázaro Cárdenas. He's the one that nationalizes the petroleum, the oil industry, right? And which is still nationalized to this day, as much as people have tried to, privatize as much as possible. In fact, now it's still run, it's still publicly owned, it's still owned by the nation, still owned, state-owned, I should say. But now it actually runs oil fields and oil refineries now it owns oil refineries in the United States. Like, like the profits from that go to, like, Mexico, not to the United, it's like a really weird setup, but like, because of the fund that they have that's paid for by the oil prices, now they're like, now even Mexico is running, U.S. oil stuff because they don't want to, right? Anyway, point being that like, this is when all this stuff happened. This is when all of the large dams, all the electrification, all of that, right? And another thing too, another reason why it was so progressive, and another reason why it horrified white Americans, was because Mexico at this point, remember, because of the Constitution, as it still exists to this day, protected indigenous languages. So it said that in any community that is, indigenous, right, like any town that's indigenous, a majority or whatever it might be, or where the people choose this to be the case, they would be instructed in bilingually. That is to say, like, they would learn Spanish so that way they could, interact with, like, the federal government, all that stuff. But they would also have to teach, and that means that the instructors, even the ones that at the main normal school, as they used to call them back in Mexico City, that means that they had to learn indigenous languages in order to go teach. Like, they had to, because you were sent off to go teach. So it was very revolutionary in that sense. Like, everybody had to get an education. And they were willing to keep funding it even in that time period where you don't see, like this is the thing with capitalism, right? It's like capitalism wants results, like, right away, right? Like, when it comes to literacy, when it comes to all this stuff. Like, the Soviet Union expanded literacy, but you don't really see the effects until, again, you have a generation of people that have already grown up in a completely literate society, right? but America sees that as a failure, although it doesn't care about literacy, right? So these are some of the, this is why, like, the first decade that it's going on, this educational reform, like, you don't see as much return on investment, quote unquote. But Mexico kept funding it because they also said, like, they also believe and they understood that people that already were illiterate not necessarily going to, like, if they're already older and, all of that stuff, they are going to receive a benefit, but they already are older. So it's not like they're going to change professions now, right? It's not like that. But their children now have that possibility because now their parents are literate. Now, et cetera, et cetera. And, like, capitalism doesn't care about that. It just wants it immediately. So, I mean, like, my school, like, here in LA, I'm not even joking. Like, when I was in 12th, in, like, my senior year of high school, they had books for my, like, government class or whatever it was called, that literally, and they said it was okay, that were from the 90s. Think about that. They were from the 90s. One of them that I remember still mentioned, like, Czechoslovakia and, like, the Soviet Union. I'm like, what the heck? Like, what? Like, I've never lived in a time when the Soviet Union was around, right? So to read a textbook at school that's talking about it as though it's presently existing was a little bit jarring, especially, by that point. I'm like, you would think, but again, it's because, of course, I mean, even now, I live in a very Mexican neighborhood. What are the neighborhoods that get the worst funding? I mean, it's always the BIPOC neighborhoods.
What had happened to Mexico's black roots? The blackest part of Mexico today is called the Costa Chica. It's on the Pacific coast, on the opposite side of the country from Veracruz. South of Acapulco and north of Puerto Escondido, the land is swampy and the towns are extremely poor. The Costa Chica has remained Mexico's blackest region for centuries because it was so isolated. There wasn't even a highway to get here until the 1950s.
So think about that, okay? From, let's just say 1550, right? From 1550 to 1950, there was no major road, right? Like, there were paths, there were, like, small little like senderos, as they would call them back in the day, which were just like that, just paths for, I guess, like, you could use, like a mule or, whatever, some kind of pack animal to move things, with a cart. But this area, like, if like people kind of recognize that Acapulco has, like, a lot of, it's very rocky, right? Because people know, like, I don't know if people, because now Acapulco's not that famous anymore, but, like, people cliff dive, right, in Acapulco, right? So, like, the coast has a lot of mountains, right? So it's, so like, the paths, the way to get there is not very easy, right? Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Raven. Thank you so much for following. I appreciate it. So essentially from 1550, I mean, again, I'm cutting 30 years off, but 1550 to 1950, 400 years of no good direct way to communicate with the rest of the country. I mean, and that was by choice too. I mean, even what I was just saying, even when Mexico was its most progressive, right, one could say, right after the revolution, and after the 1917 Constitution, even then they still did not build a road, a highway to La Costa Chica. So,
Born in Trinidad, Father Glenn Jamat has been ministering to congregations in the Costa Chica for the past 25 years. Part of Father Glenn's mission has been to raise black consciousness, even founding an annual conference of black towns. I wanted to learn from him how the Mexicans who can't pass as brown or cosmic.
Could you imagine Okay, first I want to, I'm going to comment on this, but second I'm going to comment on that last bit that you just said, cosmic. Could you imagine if in the United States they try to do a conference of black towns, of black municipalities? Like, do you know how fucking, like, the anger, the ire of white people, if that were to ever happen, or even if it was something like, you know, representing, like, urban centers with high black populations, right? You would never hear them stop talking about it. Like, they would fucking go insane on that. Like, they would literally go hog wild on that completely. Because again, that goes to show you, like I mean, again, I can't even think of anything like the conference that they do have in Mexico happening in the U.S. just because the very idea, instead of recognizing the marginalization of black people, instead would be used as a, like, well, if they can have it, then we should have a like a revival of the whites. Well, I mean, HOAs are essentially the White Citizens Council now, but you know what I mean, oh, well, now we have to have a white towns conference. You know, like, no.
Relate to their black.
Oh yeah. Also, okay. The whole idea of the cosmic race is not a good idea. Like, I know, again, if you read the book, and, you know, again, it's available online in English and in Spanish, it involves erasure, right? It involves, like, through the mixing, the culture that will be, that you see at the end, so to speak, is one that is very Europeanized, right? Because as he argues in the book, it's so then that way the whole world, or, you know, can then be put under the rule of the Roman Catholic Church. So you can see how, like, yes, you know, racial admixture, you know, blah, blah, blah. But if the cosmic race necessitates everybody becoming a Roman Catholic, what does that mean for everybody else, right? Like, this is where I often have objected with his work. Like, he knows that Jewish people live in Mexico. In fact, he's one of the people that, like, we know mentions Jews in Mexico City at the time in his writing. And in this particular book, he's essentially also writing the Jewish people as if though they will become an anthropological relic, right? Like, oh, there used to be said people, right? And here's their history, and here are their artifacts, but they no longer exist as such, right? Because now we have the cosmic race, right? So that's the problem I have with him using the idea of cosmic. Nobody identifies as cosmic, so, because technically we haven't reached it yet, so, you know.
And their heritage of slavery.
The first occasion when I said a mass, a grown man came and he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm the priest." And for about 10 minutes, he went on, "You're not a priest. You couldn't be a priest. I've never seen a black priest. We black people only work the land. We load trucks and whatever.
You can't be the head man."
Exactly. And he was really talking about himself. Everything is against an African Mexican seeing himself as someone who can lift his head and take his place in Mexican society, isn't it?
Exactly. Like, that's the thing when it comes to Afro-Mexicans. The very idea that they could, like, say, once again have another Afro-Mexican president, that's like something that I mean, again, most people don't even know that La Costa Chica exists, right? That it is a majority black part of Mexico, let alone the vast dispossession, marginalization, right, and everything else that comes with it. And also come to realize that that even there, that the people are cognizant of their marginalization, right? Like, yes, you know, Mexico has one of the most progressive charters in the world, right? This is true, right? It was written at the same time as the Bolshevik Revolution, right? However, it's only as progressive as the most marginalized people that it has in its society, right? Like, that's the problem when people think about the Constitution, the U.S. Like, they see it as this, like, deific, document, as opposed to, like, if it is true that the Constitution is whatever, blah, 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 like flows through the veins of all Americans, right, quote unquote, then that means that the most oppressed American it is incumbent upon us to make it be a reality for the most oppressed American. Otherwise, then the Constitution is worthless, which it is. I mean, it is. But the point being that it's like the people that try to deify it, or make it seem almost like it's some kind of like hagiographic text, right? It's like, no, it's not. It's a text that literally was written with slavery all over it. It's just that those parts aren't included anymore, right? And then in its amendments, it didn't even abolish slavery. It just abolished, private slavery, right? Like, they're fine with, well, I guess now with private prisons you have private slavery, but I think people understand what I mean.
A racial controversy in 2005 brought Mexico unwanted international attention. The Mexican government issued a commemorative stamp featuring the popular black cartoon character Memín Pinguin. Most Mexicans love this character, but African Americans were incensed, calling it a racist throwback. Jesse Jackson even flew to Mexico City to complain about it personally to President Vicente Fox. The stamp became an instant collector's item, and the comic book was reissued from its first printing.
You want to know the worst part about this? Is I know this woman, or I shouldn't say I know, I don't know her anymore. I mean, but like, she was like, I forget if it was at my aunt or my uncle's work, but she collected these comics. Like, she had a whole bunch of them, and like, even me just looking at them, I'm like, no, like, I don't want to, no, like, no.
Government never apologized and has never recalled the stamp.
Which is, again, it's a huge L.
Penguin.
because again, like, the way how they try to argue is they try to do the whole, like, debate bro thing, like, well, it's artistic, it's, I mean, it's like how now, like, there are people that are denying queer people things because it's like, oh, well, now this is artistic, right? Because of the Supreme Court. But it's like, that's what they did. Well, it's such a beloved character. It's like, well, so was Jim Crow back in the day. It doesn't mean that we're going to issue Jim Crow I mean, you know what I mean? I mean, like, I don't know. At this point in the U.S., I have no idea what they will do. But, like, again, using something that is literally minstrelsy, right? Even in its depicted form in a cartoon, is not, like, worth keeping, right? Like, it's not worth defending. And of course, this was now almost 20 years ago, but like, this kind of art is still around too. Most prominently in anime. I will put any money that the new panty and stocking anime isn't gonna change anything. Oh yeah, I have heard of that. No Comment Chick has talked about that, about panty and stocking, because they have received a lot of complaints about that. And then I think did Pokemon get that too with didn't Pokemon also get, like, change some of its Pokemon or some of its something like that because of backlash from that too? I mean, like, for example, like I learned yesterday that they're gonna make a new Willy Wonka. Oh yeah, well, on Polystream is where we talked about it. Is like, if you read the book, the Oompa Loompas are from Africa. Mr. Popo from Dragon Ball Z got changed from black to blue. Yeah, and I think Jinx, right? Didn't Jinx get changed because before it was it's portrayed as black, right? And then they changed it to where it's purple, if I remember correctly. Yeah, Jinx. Yeah, Jinx was the Pokemon. I'm pretty sure it was Jinx. I want to say there was another one, but I could just be misremembering. I don't know. But yeah. But again, it's like this whole thing, like, oh, you know, it was a beloved character, and we're saying, you know, Mexican art, blah, blah, blah. Like, hi, Iron, how are you? What a face to make. But yeah, that was just something that, like, I never understood when that, and I mean, this happened before I was even, like, really, like, I wasn't really, so, as it were, around, when this went on. But I do remember it being brought up afterwards. And in fact, when I was, in a course, right, in my undergrad, I actually made it a point, oh, that's wonderful to hear, 4-month anniversary, that's great. In essence, like, I wanted to bring it up for our discussion because, and that is not to say I wanted to show Mimi Penguin, but I wanted to say, like, kind of what we're doing here, right? Where I'm sort of talking about, you know, stuff that's forgotten or stuff that's never taken into consideration in the U.S., but also isn't even taken into consideration in the country itself, right? Like Mexico. And trying to, like, discuss the relationship. Just at work, just listening. I got my work headphones in so I can hear what you're saying. Oh, okay.
Hey, boss, you looks like Samuel.
The Mexicans were very intelligent people. Their reaction was, you cannot judge him by racist standards of the end of the century because it was based on the 1940s. So there's nothing wrong about the Penguin. You sort of pinch yourself to see what it says.
See, like, I feel like that's what people are gonna be like, well, it's in the 1940s. Bro, like, do you know what was going on in the 1940s? You know what I mean? Like, that's like a weird argument. Like, well, you know, it was the 40s. Like, yes, it was in the 40s. You would think that would, you know, want us to get rid of it even more, you know, not defend it. But, you know, whatever. I don't know. They're the ones that don't go inside the ear so I can wear them. Oh, okay.
Is something wrong with me?
Free your mind, brother.
And you see the extent to which people have really bought into a system which is biased.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, in your experience, they'll have a Barack Obama in this generation?
I don't think so. There's so much.
I'm sad to say that Father here is correct, right? That I just don't see. I mean, the amount of one, misogyny, and two, anti-Semitism that came out just from the idea that Claudia Sheinbaum would run for president, like, literally, like, people who were otherwise very, you know, progressive, whatever, blah blah blah, like, they all came out and were all like, oh, she doesn't know how to do this, blah blah blah, she doesn't, you know, like, suddenly now everybody's a misogynist, so to speak. Like everybody's, like, nitpicking every little thing. And again, I don't care one way or the other whether she wins or not. Like, that's not important to me as such, that is to say. Like, but it's crazy how quickly, as soon as there was the, like, oh, when she announced she would like to run, right, how quickly people changed to actually, like, graffiti, like, there was anti-Semitic graffiti against her, and it's like, it's crazy how quickly that switch went on, right? Like, because people don't think, like, Mexico anti-Semitism, right? Like, they think that's so, like, that's because it's built out of white supremacy, obviously, but it shows how it's pervasive through different methods, right? It's not just someone who is a bit of a, you know, Hitler stan, right, is going to be the one that's going to do that. No, it's even someone who just wants to go back to, like, the like the the parties of stability, right? Like, although stability is pretty fascist anyway.
Has to be done before Black Mexicans have access to education, political participation, social acceptance, and these things must be in place before you begin to produce leaders. I would also say that I've seen changes there. I now hear young people saying in a more assertive fashion, soy negro.
Why?
It is because of the kind of visibility we've been able to generate. And all things that have spun off from that.
Hey, how you doing, brother? Hey, what? This place looks like Harlem to me. This looks like Africa, Mexico. It does. It's great.
We speak Spanish, but we believe in the resurrected Christ. I mean, the Spanish culture, the European culture is also in us. Because of that, it's difficult to say we're only blacks. What are we? A mix?
See, like, this is where I think it's an interesting aspect because and this is where I think more research, I guess, could be done, but also just more discussions. Like, this is but again, this is not for me necessarily to discuss. I mean, it's not, like, in the sense of, like, Afro-Mexican, but, like, it is interesting, but also someone who, is more of a specialist in this topic, to think about why there is this, again, this, I guess it does also apply to me, at least in the familial sense, right, is why they think that by having adopted, right, Spanish culture, right, that because there has been that, cultural exchange, right, that somehow that negates their blackness in some way, like from being able to, you know what I mean? I mean, I don't know if I feel like I'm not elaborating that correctly, but it's like what the reporter, the person they were interviewing just said, like, oh well, we're not because we have Spanish culture. It's like, I mean, it's not as though you like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not as though you can just, like, instead it shows that the cultures of where the original African ancestors, right, that were brought over, it's them affecting the culture, the hegemonic culture around them to create their own unique place in right, their own unique culture. And to me, I feel like that's, I don't know, I feel like that's an interesting thing to hear someone say, is like, oh, we can't claim it because it's infused with other elements. I don't know.
It's a mix.
Eduardo Zapata is a journalist, a native Costa Chican, and an example of the new generation Father Glenn mentioned, a generation proud of their black identity. What did these people gather to celebrate?
That one of them was ordained a priest. He makes many of the people here feel proud. The Toro de Petate is danced throughout all of America, from Argentina to Mexico.
The Toro de Petate dance celebrates the bull, which is part of most Latin American cultures. But when it's danced in Afro-Latino communities, the bull has a special significance. His valor becomes a metaphor for freedom from slavery.
Oh my gosh, you want to know? I just remembered something. Like, seeing this reminded me of something that Mexico does, and that because it tries to be like, oh, like, essentially what Mexico did when it did the whole Mestizaje thing is that it tried to do the whole, like, we're colorblind in a way. Not exactly, but like it's something akin to that, or at least going that direction. Is that certain cultural things, like practices that pertain to particularly indigenous cultures, or that were brought into the general mestizo culture, were then seen as, like, I don't want to say open season, because I feel like that's like a weird way of putting it, but like it allows for people to essentially do like indigenous face, right? Like, it allows them to like pretend, right, to put on as if they're an indigenous person as a costume, right? And this also happens in a religious sense too, where when people want to dress up like Juan Diego, right? Like people will darken their skin to look more indigenous. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's like that's something that and obviously, you know, they can't touch on everything in this documentary, but that's something else that kind of sticks out to me. It's like seeing some of these things reminds me of these dances that are done that like I've seen like little and they make little children do this. So this is where like it's not the little children's fault that they make them do this, right? Rather it's the parents perpetuating this, you know, brown face, etc. And I don't know, like I always found it very weird. Like my family didn't do it, of course, because we're not Catholic, right? Like the whole Juan Diego, the whole because these things are associated with Catholic holidays. But I just remember growing up, like I would see people dress up in like, again, in indigenous garb, and you know, I don't know. It's a very strange thing.
Are you described as a black person, a Negro here in Mexico?
No. Of course. When you're little, nobody questions it. When you live here, when you go to Mexico City to study, you go to Acapulco, you go to the US, and you realize you're different. But you're Mexican, but you have something that's not the same as all Mexicans. You discover that...
What the Zapatistas had the same? I wonder that too. Because I don't know if... See, that's the problem, is like if they couch it in Catholicism, which is one way how I know people have gotten away with this before, like, or at least historically, has been because it's seen as a religious, right? Like, oh, because La Virgencita, right, the Virgen de Guadalupe, es la morenita, right? Is the tawny one, quote unquote, right? Is the dark one, right? This is why when FLFNF earlier said, oh, would they say moreno to say black? Like it's like when they talk about the Virgen de Guadalupe, right? The Virgin of Guadalupe. She's sometimes called La Morenita, but they mean it as indigenous, right? And that's more how I've heard it in central Mexico anyway. And so, from what I understand, all of those religious things where they couch it in that, because this is built over hundreds of years, I don't know what the Zapatista would say about that particularly, or even other groups that exist now. Like I know the Zapatistas are the most well known. But there are other, particularly in Yucatan, resistance that resist, right, being, because Yucatan does have a very separate, I mean, it used to be its own country, for Pete's sake. From Mexico, that is. So I do know that there are other groups, maybe not as well known or as militant, I guess, as the Zapatistas. But I'm wondering what they would say too, because I do know in Mexico City there's an indigenous rights group that I know very well. I don't want to say it because it's it's not really big. It's not like a national group. It's just like a group that I know. But like they would probably know best about that, or at least they would set me on the right path to research on my own. But yeah, like. Because it's actually people, I mean, again, and I've even seen, like, white Mexicans. Like, that's the issue. Like, that's what I'm thinking of. Like, white Mexicans, not even, like, mestizos like me or other people, right? I'm talking about, like, white Mexicans, right? Like the person that comes to mind, again, this was when they were a child, right? Is that the girl had blonde hair. I mean, it doesn't matter that she's a blonde, but this was in Mexico. And they made her have trenzas and dressed her up like an indigenous woman, right? Or like an indigenous, But yeah, that raises a lot of questions because like then they also made her look as though she were indigenous, right? And then her then the boy, who was also white Mexican, like they actually like darkened his skin. So, but again, this was when I was a child, right? This is like me thinking like I was older than they were, but like now thinking of it in reference to this, it's always been something that kind of, because they always tie it to religion and to religious festival, somehow that gave it an okay culturally. But I think that's also because, again, there's that belief, like almost in the way how I explained it before, that like white people think, well, because they define space, therefore every space is a space where they can be in, right, so to speak, right? Yeah, I'm generally curious. I'm not sure about it either. I believe one of the Zapatistas' latest leaders isn't even a Maya indigenous person. Right, and that might be the case. And of course, one of their things that Portillo Saldaña writes in Who's the Indian in Aztlán, right? Again, using the term Indian because in Mexico, in Latin America, the term people refer to indigenous people often is indio, right? In fact, there's like a famous, like one of the most popular beers, and I've seen it sold in the United States, well, at least in California. I don't know, like Southern California is like its own thing. I don't even know what else to compare it to. But like they will sell El Indio, which is a beer that they sell, but it's originally from the central Mexico. Anyway. But the point being, I mean, that's just an example, right? And then there's also that thing too, where like indigenous people to people who are identified with the constructed nationalist mestizaje culture, right? Don't see it, cannot, as it were, tell the difference between one of the many Maya, groupings of people, right? Of the many Maya groupings. And any other group, right? Like they see them all the same in essence, right? So that's also a problem too when it comes to this, because that's what also allows people to sort of like pick and choose, right? Like pick out of a out of a box, like, oh well, this is cool, this is interesting, right? But they're divorcing it from its original culture. And that's how I've always felt about that, because they say, oh, it's a thing that happens in Puebla, right? But Puebla is a state that has a lot of indigenous people, so is it like, but again, it's very complicated when, again, you are dealing with mestizaje, church tradition, etc. You know what I mean? So, but I am curious to know about that.
You're black.
Do black people suffer discrimination here in Mexico?
Yes, we are a racist society. If you're in the cities...
Yes, Mexico, yes. Yes, 1,000 million %, yes, Mexico is a very racist society. Once I was hanging out with a friend who was white, or like a white Mexican, and like they literally forgot I was even there. Like, it's happened to me all the time. In fact, that was something growing up that people would tell me, like, well, I had like a, I think, like, oh, as soon as you introduce your lighter skin, as they would say, like tu amigo güero, right? Because I had a few friends back in Mexico that, like, one of them was like a ginger, one of them was had light brown hair, right? And they both had ojos claros, right? Because I don't have color. Like, my eyes are just brown, okay? Like, they're just brown. And so, the whole point being that, like, if you take your friends with you to around people that you want them to give attention to you, so to speak, don't take them. Otherwise, they will completely focus on them. That was, like, advice I was given growing up with friends. Like as a, which is a way of saying, like, in Mexico, colorism, right, but also racism, right, which is, it's like a Russian nesting doll, right? They're one and the same, so to speak, but they're different aspects. Is something that you're going to have to experience for the rest of your life, right? and to normalize it in some way, right? By saying, well, oh, you know, they have ojos claros, you know, like, oh, well, they have colored eyes and you don't, so, you know, things like that. But it always was like, when it did happen, it was like an instant thing, right? Like, they would instead, like, I'm thinking about the one friend that had light brown hair and like green eyes, is that they would immediately focus on him instead of me. Like, me, I just stopped existing. Because they're like, oh yeah, it's just another, regular Mexican person. But this person is unique, right? It was like this really weird feeling. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like a really weird thing to describe, but like, I was told, like, you know, colorism, racism, Mexico's a super racist society, as are all societies in the world because of white supremacy.
They stop you, ask you for your ID card, they make you sing the national anthem. They could accuse you of coming from Cuba to destabilize things.
That is something that, yes, that is something else too. Family that they say, oh, well, they're not Mexican. And instead they would say, oh, well, tu tía Ana is Cubana, right? Like, oh, like she's Cuban, and she's not Cuban. It's like, she's not from Cuba. She's just black, like, just, but it's this way of rationalizing, like, of trying to deal with blackness, right? Of trying to, like, deny it, right, on one hand, but also, like, oh yeah, you're, you know, like, well, so then are we Cuban now, or like, what is this, right? It's like, oh no, we're not Cuban, we're all Mexican. Well then, but you just said, you know, like, it doesn't make any sense. And no, I just made up the name and the, you know, all of that. But I'm just saying, like, it's as if they would have told me that, right? Like this is true. I have heard this before.
No se dice. It isn't said, but in every Mexican family there is a black person. And do you know what the city folks say?
Los de la ciudad?
They say he was born black, but we love him anyway.
Tell me about Lemon Penguin.
Wait, what did he say? I didn't hear what he just said.
They could accuse you of coming from Cuba to destabilize things or something like that.
No se dice.
It isn't said, but in every Mexican family there is a black person. And do you know what the city folks say?
Los de la ciudad?
They say he was born black, but we love him anyway.
Oh, yes. Oh my god, that is so fucking toxic. There is a book by a really famous Mexican writer named Laura Esquivel, who wrote the book like Water for Chocolate. That's probably the most famous of her books. But in that book, she literally does racial essentialism, biological essentialism. And then she came out with a new book that the title, like, if you were to translate it literally, would be My Black Secret, right? And it's based on the what is revealed in that book, like Water for Chocolate. That the mother had an affair with a black man, and that one of the daughters, who, by the way, in this movie, which is partially in English anyway, because it takes place on the U.S.-Texas border, on the Mexico-Texas border. It's by, like, Eagle Pass. Is it still called that, Eagle Pass? I don't know. Anyway, it's, like, in that area. I, like, literally has it, like, or maybe it's by El Paso. I don't know. Now I'm getting confused. Anyway, but, like, they say, like, the reason why this one sister, who is, again, in the movie, is depicted as very white, because in Mexican cinema for, like, years, decades since, you know, it began, has always been, like, mostly white. Like, only side characters or whatever were of any other, right, race or of mixed ancestry, whatever, mestizo, etc. And so, I lost my train of thought. Let's see, what was I saying? That Mexican cinema. Oh yeah, so they depict Gertrudis, this character in the book, one of the sisters, as being mulata, essentially. But in the movie, she's super white and has like blue eyes, very like dirty blonde hair, and she's like everything about her is like all biological racial essentialism, like secretly, because she's black, right? But it's hidden, right? That's why she's good at dancing, right? It's like this really weird like justification of, I don't even know. But that's something I've never quite understood, that like in that movie, it's like, why would you like, who, I don't know. Okay. But I don't know. Okay, everyone. We are going to raid Miss Anita Bump. Everyone, please get into the little robot. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you all next time.
Now, we're going to do something we haven't done in a while.
Thank you.
So, over the last week or so, there's been a lot of attention paid to a music video we're going to get into in just 1 second.